Dober dan, dobrodošli v Muzeju za arhitekturo in oblikovanje. Welcome to the Museum of Architecture and Design, MAO, which is a national museum that collects, preserves, studies and exhibits various materials related to fields of architecture, design and photography, mainly from the 20th and 21st century. But MAO is not just a conventional museum that, in fact, takes care of the heritage, but also works as a so-called production platform that develop new projects, which are in fact a kind of reactions that question systems of our everyday life and also develops alternatives. At the same time, now, MAO is national accelerator for the development of Slovenian creative and cultural sector through its various programs such as Center of Creativity, Made in Platform for Contemporary Crafts and Design, Slovenian Pavilion at Venice Architecture Biennial, and also the Biennial of Design, BIO, which is the oldest design biennial in the world. It started in 1964 and now we celebrate its 60th years. With all these projects, we aim to support also contemporary creatives and practices. And it was exactly the Biennial of Design in 2014, 10 years ago, when we started to collaborate with Aljoša Dekleva and Dekleva-Gregorič architects and founders of Dekleva-Gregorič arhitekti, because they were invited as mentors to the international team of designers, architects and artists to develop the topic of nanotourism through various aspects. At that time, 10 years ago, we asked a crucial question. After decades of a booming tourism industry with wide impact on territories and economies all over the world, are there a smaller scale, non-intrusive ways of promoting a tourism experience? And I would like to rephrase this question in the context of today's symposium and your workshop. After a decade of a booming industry, tourism industry in Ljubljana, are there smaller scale, non-intrusive ways of promoting its Plečnik's heritage? Already 10 years ago, we partnered with Visiting School of Architectural Association, School of Architecture from London, and we are really excited to host you here again at the symposium. And also, we cannot wait to see your nanotourism projects, the projects that I'm sure will propose site-specific, participatory, and locally oriented alternatives to existing tourism industry in Ljubljana. So welcome to the symposium, and I wish you a fruitful and very exciting days here in Ljubljana.
Thank you, Maja, for this introduction to today's symposium. And thank you also for long-lasting collaborations, which, as you mentioned, started 10 years ago. But I'm very happy that these collaborations are continuing today, and they, I'm sure, are going to continue also into the future. So, welcome to this symposium titled Plečnik, the City and Nanotourism. And to put the symposium a little bit in the context, it is part of a kickoff day that we have started today, this morning, at the Faculty of Architecture here in Ljubljana, with a group of 20 international students that are going to spend 2 weeks from today on researching, designing and making prototypes of understanding our built environments through understanding Ljubljana and through understanding Plečnik. So what we aim to provide is new insights into the relevance of Plečnik's works for today and establish a framework for a broader discussion and expanded discourse on Plečnik's works and its, most importantly, impact on the citizens and visitors of Ljubljana. What you see on the screen is a program booklet for this architectural educational program that starts today and collaborates with the museum to make this symposium. So, to maybe say a couple of more words on nanotourism, which Maja, you have very precisely and concisely kind of summarized it of what happened 10 years ago. Yes, it was a wonderful collaboration. BO50 was the platform where nanotourism was in a way produced in collaboration with the Architectural Association. The question that we asked ourselves, it was also why does tourism matter today, and also why does it matter from an architectural perspective. And we know that over the past century, the tourism has experienced continued growth and rapid intensification, so to become one of the fastest growing economies in the world. In terms of business volume, it surpasses the economies of car industry or food industry, which is something that actually defines our life quite thoroughly. So the same it does tourism. And tourism, it has become integral to our lives, and it's heavily influencing our built and social environments. So to change our perspective on how we visit places and how we better understand the places that we live in, we proposed this constructed term, nanotourism, which represents a creative critique to a conventional tourism's current environmental and social downsides. So the product of collaboration through BO50, it was this kind of little booklet that summarizes the works in 2014, which we put on the cover in a way a working description or definition of what nanotourism is or could be, which is that nanotourism is a site-specific, participatory, and locally oriented bottom-up alternative that stretches beyond tourism. And it is more an attitude dedicated to improving specific everyday environments, and it's creating a better integrated user experience. So, to move on, why we are here and why Plečnik, we have for our 10th edition of our Nanotourism Visiting School as an architecture education facility, we decided to come back to Slovenia, to Ljubljana. It is European pocket-sized capital, but most importantly also for the fact that the works of Jože Plečnik have been a couple of years ago part of inscription of this into UNESCO World Heritage List. And that it is a very high-level cultural achievement on worldwide, and I think we all are not aware enough what this means for our environment and what it also means for the echo to the world on international basis. Probably we can all agree that Plečnik's works, in a way, define what Ljubljana is today, quite directly. The other thing which I think it's worth to focus, and I'm sure other people are going to speak about that Plečnik has created small interventions that compound together a thorough understanding of how urbanity it is manifested in a small city as Ljubljana is. It is also written in the UNESCO that it's Plečnik's contribution to Ljubljana. It's regarded as an urban whole. And we are looking at Plečnik's urban plan, which combines a top-down and a bottom-up principle. So he clearly took Fabiani's already top-down plan of Ljubljana urbanism, urban proposal, but added on all his kind of works, already some of existing works and some planned works as a bottom-up alternative to a top-down approach of how to kind of create an urban planning for the city. So instead of thinking in a matter of grand gestures, he understands small specific places, enhances them, and they in unison with a correlation with other interventions that he's placing around the city, create this kind of urban hall and urbanity. So we believe there is yet unexplored potential in better integrating this top-level cultural recognition into visitors' experience and everyday lives of Ljubljana inhabitants. Of course, extensive research on Plečnik work has been already done by a generation of researchers, art historians, and architects that have created solid foundation and made significant contribution to the understanding of the master's work. And we have all of those kind of stored in the books. And I have to mention we have a mini library where all the books are there in the workshop that we are conducting. But with the last year's 150th anniversary of Plečnik's birth, new views and attitude have been established in response to the current state of cultural affairs. So the symposium aims to tease out new and fresh views on Plečnik's legacy that reach beyond the traditional discourse on historicity, on historical views that are not bound by a certain accepted view of Plečnik. So the collection of speakers today, it represents this kind of fresh ideas and fresh views of what has been kind of started last year, celebrating the 150th anniversary, in order to create a knowledge platform for the student group to continue working for these 2 weeks. So that would be all for the introduction, and I have the pleasure to announce Tomaž Štoka, who is an art historian and curator at MAO, but it was also a very crucial coordinator of a group of professionals who have worked extensively on the project of Plečnik's nomination for UNESCO World Heritage. And as we heard today in your small presentation to the students, you were quite successful because it was the first application that was accepted, and it's quite different than previous with other architectural inscriptions. So Tomaž, please take on the stage.
So, hello. Thank you, Alyosha and Vit, for the invitation. It's always a great honor and satisfaction to participate with AA Nanotourism. So today I will talk a bit about the inscription of Plečnik's works on the UNESCO World Heritage List and a bit on the values of his urban interventions. So maybe for the introduction, 3-4 minutes more like UNESCO topics. So 3 years ago, the World Heritage Committee followed the recommendation of ICOMOS and inscribed the selected works of Jože Plečnik in Ljubljana on the UNESCO World Heritage List. So the inscription recognizes the so-called outstanding universal value of the selected works by Plečnik. So this word, outstanding universal value, keep this in mind because this is a key concept for the World Heritage System and its convention. So this is a great honor for Plečnik's works and also a big commitment to the systematic care of the World Heritage Site. So what did we inscribe? So basically in the core we have 2 axes. The first one is the green axis that goes from the Trnava Bridge, maybe if the mouse is working. So Trnava Bridge, and here we have green axis together with Vegova Street, the library, Park Zvezda and Congress Square. Then the other basis is this mouse is the water axis that goes from Trnava Quay to the sluice gates, and in this part is also 3 bridges, marketplace, and Cobbler's Bridge. And then in the center we have, let me see the mouse, we have Roman walls in Myria, and then on the outskirts we have two churches and Žale, Saints of All Garden. So, as I mentioned, the World Heritage System is based on the World Heritage Convention from 1972. In the convention, as I mentioned before, the key concept is the OUV. So if I simplify, any property that is inscribed on the list means that it has the outstanding universal value, which means it has cultural significance, which is so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries and to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity. And to achieve this status, the work must fulfill three different pillars. The first one is the content criteria, the second one is that it meets the condition of integrity and authenticity, and the third one is the management system. And if anything of this is missing, then you can't be inscribed, or if you are already inscribed and anything of this is missing, then you are first place on danger list, and then you can be also removed. So regarding the justification of the values, it is very important to go through the process of valorization and articulation of the heritage to identify the values that can be seen as universal. And when you identify the values, you have to show that they are readable, that they can be recognized through attributes. And what is quite important is that you need to have in mind that description is not justification. So we aren't just describing things, but we are going through articulation of architecture, and we interpret the values that architecture has. So I really like this short sentence from UNESCO that facts do not replace good arguments, because of course facts are important, but if you aren't capable to interpret the data, then you miss the point. And of course you have to also very early in the process make a break with some values that are, for example, important in national context, and on the other side are irrelevant in the World Heritage context. So with Plečnik, for example, is, let's say, his personality status and national figure, which is in World Heritage system doesn't make an argument for a successful inscription. Or if I quote convention, it is a property-based convention, so it's not a list of people. Also, on the other hand, we have values in Plečnik architecture that we saw important, especially in the past. Let's say, for example, Plečnik's architecture language. In his works, Plečnik is searching new forms on the basis of classical and global architecture. If I, let's say, exaggerate and joke a bit and use the words of a colleague from Estonia, sometimes it looks a bit like Stalinist architecture, but it doesn't feel like Stalinist architecture. But yeah, joke aside, in nomination we also use this Plečnik's architecture language as a potential attribute. And it doesn't go further, yeah. And the result of the elevation was next, that ICOMOS saw this as an important part of Plečnik's architecture, but it was seen only as a supportive attribute, so not as a highlight. So then we came to the key point of the values of Plečnik's Ljubljana, also for the World Heritage List. So what about shaping the human-centered public space as an outstanding universal value? A space that forms an open platform for quality public space, open to a variety of uses and meanings. A space that is sensitively integrated into the pre-existing urban context, spaces where bridges become squares with open views to the river, or spaces rich with small and big interventions that form essential parts of cities' everyday life, or spaces where funeral complex becomes an important place for more human public space. So yes, at the end, the selected works of Jože Plečnik in Ljubljana were inscribed as an example of human-centered urban design. So the inscription consists of a series of public spaces and public institutions that were sensitively integrated into the pre-existing urban, natural and cultural contexts. If I go a bit to a description, to let's say, to a wider historical urban context, we see that Plečnik's mental landscape can be read as a puzzle composed of older urban ideas and his own inventions. So rather than looking for a new revolutionary model of urbanism following modern trends, Plečnik still found the imperative to integrate the old with the new, to strike a balance between new urban requirements and traditional patterns. So Plečnik studied in Vienna in the 90s. He was a student of Otto Wagner, and also at the same time Camillo Sitte was very popular theoretician in Austro-Hungarian Empire and wider. And both Wagner and Sitte saw the city as work of art, as a complex integration of the old and the new. And Plečnik was very, let's say, innovative in combining both his role models' ideas. Let's say, with micro-urban interventions in Ljubljana, he emphasized inherited topographic sites and viewed them into a meticulously shaped network of urban surprises in line with Sitte's principle. And on the other hand, his plan for Greater Ljubljana relies also on Wagner's concept for the Großstadt. So most of Plečnik's projects for Ljubljana took place in the 30s. Plečnik's work at the time was typologically and programmatically varied. And within a very short period of time, he designed public and city-forming institutions such as library, market, churches, a cemetery complex, and other, transforming the provincial city into symbolic capital. At the same time, he constructed urban infrastructure with important public spaces such as bridges, riverbanks, streets, and public squares. Plečnik was an urban designer in the finest sense, erecting monuments, renovating streets, adding landmarks such as pyramids and columns, replacing pavings, balustrades, and staircases, while paying special attention to landscaping with new street greenery and park areas. So, he introduced complexity to the city and a variety of uses by integrating various scales of intervention from urban planning, redesign of larger spatial ensembles like squares, streets, parks, and other, to designing urban furniture such as benches, lights, and more. He created spatial choices for users, allowing them to connect various uses and meanings and create new identities. He explored concreteness of space and filled it with content through various interventions. The resulting interaction between different scales provide users with accessibility, a sense of orientation, and freedom of choice. So here you can see, let's say, three nice examples, how in one side he forms orientation with forming a series of these dramaturgical lines, and when you are walking through them, you are discovering his in-between spaces where you can move a bit away or use them in different ways. Plečnik's vision of urban space design is conceived also as a recollection of fragments that he carefully collected, interpreted, and reimagined. He returned function to the historical layers of the city, upgrading its traditional functions and discovering new uses and urban potentials. His interventions recalled the map of ancient, medieval, and Baroque Ljubljana and presented its current image as a result of historical layers, referencing the city's present to its monumental past. So, Plečnik's interventions also highlight these inherited topographical features of space, shaping them into a carefully designed sequence of diverse spaces. The main compositional principle is the selection of points which are programmatically diverse or offer interesting views. The importance of the points in space is expressed by the density of forms. The individual works were often marked in space with small intervention and only later connected into a unified gesture. The connection of points form axes, and longitudinal axes cross the transversal axes and thus create an urban network. So the real experience of Plečnik's axes come from walking or wandering through public space. The collective effect of such a ramble is the feeling that Plečnik is present everywhere, the feeling that the architect took the city in its totality and made a minor correction here and there and a major intervention at important points, introducing entirely new elements, functions, and understandings. So Ljubljana offers a sense of Plečnik's total command over the city, but at the same time, his hand was light enough to leave the city's basic appearance and function unchanged. So if we return to our inscription and outstanding universal value, so the main value is human-centered urban design. Public space is not built new, but upgraded with minor and major interventions. Public space is contextualized and adapted to human needs. Space is filled with different meanings and functions. The user or pedestrian is drawn to identify and read the place, and also the use of materials is innovative. And then we put these values in 4 different attributes. The first one is revealing the context of the town. So here in the nomination or in the inscription, better said, we show how the architect did not wish to replace the town with a new one, but instead respected the existing space and emphasized its spatial qualities. So the historical and natural layers of the space, which have developed over hundreds of years, are recognized and emphasized in the inscribed property. Then the next one is creating a town in human scale. So Plečnik's Ljubljana is based on the idea of individual human experience and people's emotional relation to the space. The basis is understanding people's diverse needs with an accent on the pedestrian and his perception of the town. The space invites the individual into a dialogue with the city by introducing various themes and narratives into the mix. And the third one is diversity of meanings and functions. So here we can see how bridges in Plečnik's Ljubljana are not merely crossings of the river, but also function as a square above the river. Or the streets are transformed into vista points with cultural contents, and the library, let's say, functions as a temple of wisdom. And then the last one, fourth one, is the economy of the intervention. So, as we mentioned, Ljubljana was built mostly in the 30s, in the time of considerable financial limits, and the architect had to respond to these circumstances with inventive solutions to reduce construction costs. So, in a number of cases, the existing architecture was included into the new one, where in other cases he reused the old elements and put them into new functions. So, basically, today we recognize Plečnik's works as a world heritage, which gives us a commitment to preserve the architect's works. But also important is that we see in them contemporary meaning. They give us inspiration for new ideas, and they remind us that as a society we have to be oriented to develop more friendly and human common spaces. Thank you.
Is this working? Yes. Thank you, Tomaž. And it's my great pleasure to invite Petra Čeferin, who is an architect that practices theory and philosophy of architecture. But she is also author of numerous publications and books, and a professor at the Faculty of Architecture, leading the theoretical or department for theory in architecture. Please, Petra.
Thank you, Alyosha, for inviting me. Thank you, Vid. Hello, everybody. I will continue where my colleague Tomaž stopped. I guess this is meant for tall people. Ne? You can just see my eyes. It's nice, ne? With glasses. Okay, whatever. I try to say something. Okay, so I will focus in my presentation. Thanks. I will focus on the constructions of public space of Plečnik in Ljubljana in the 1920s and 30s, which means in the territory that Tomaž very nicely introduced now. And I will be interested in this particular aspect of these spaces, their characterization of as human-centered architecture or human-centered urban design. So I will focus on this aspect in my short presentation. But I will add something to this argument which I think is absolutely essential. What Plečnik, I think, put in the center of his work were not initially people, but actually architecture. I think that his fundamental central project consisted in how to construct architecture in the world, how to make it materially present in the world, from case to case, from task to task, and that is architecture as a creative thinking practice. Another thing is important here. In just such a consistent architectural way, Plečnik designed public space. That is, space which is accessible to all, should be open to all, which means that in this space, architecture can be reached by all, potentially. In his designing of public space, Plečnik did not adjust his design to the established architectural norms, nor did he try to cater to the popular taste. Rather, he insisted, and I think this is crucial, on pursuing architecture in all its intellectual difficulty. So Plečnik not only insisted on architecture, but he actually insisted on systematically developing architecture as architecture for all. And, which is crucial here, he also succeeded in this project. So here I arrive to the central point of my argument. Precisely because of Plečnik's systematic construction of architecture as architecture for all, we can say that his architecture is human-centered. So my argument is that it is human-centered because it is the result of creative thinking. And this is what I will try to develop now. In addition to that, I have to say that a human being who is at the center of Plečnik's architecture is not a human being as she is or as she happens to be. We usually say an ordinary human being, blah, blah, blah. Nor it is some ideal human being that an architect envisions as a human being that should be. But this is my emphasis. At the center of architecture as a creative thinking practice is a human being as she can become precisely as the result of her encounter with architecture, or actually with any creative thinking practice. And this is the human being who has activated her capacity for creative thinking. And thus, I won't develop this in this short presentation, but I will mention it. With this activating one's capacity for creative thinking, she enters into what the French philosopher Jacques Rancière names the process of intellectual emancipation. So maybe just to turn the screw of this human-centered a bit, I would say that the human being that is at the center of architecture as a creative thinking practice and Plečnik's architecture is not exactly strolling, relaxed, contemplated citizen, but is actually a human being that is kind of out of joint. This is the human being that is at the center of Plečnik's architecture, and this is what I will develop now. So I hope to show with this short presentation that architecture has a certain transformative capacity. Not only Plečnik's architecture, but any architecture which is practiced as creative thinking. And this is the capacity to transform or actually co-create a human being. Co-create her as an emancipated spectator, an emancipated user, or we can also say an emancipated producer of architecture. I will do this in 3 steps. Okay, so let's begin with the question, what does it mean to practice architecture as a creative thinking? First, I will do this in 2 points. So what is absolutely essential? The first point is that the architect who practices architecture in this way does not start with the question how to solve a given task, the task that it was assigned to to him, or I will speak in general, assigned to architecture. Instead, architecture begins by redefining the task itself. It begins by transforming the given task into an architectural task. What does that mean? And this is the second point. This means that while architecture is solving a certain task, let's say a construction of public space, it is at the same time constructing itself as architecture in the world. Put in other words, that architecture develops an architectural solution for a given task means that it constructs that particular object which it seeks to make as an object that is specific to architecture, that is, architectural object, and not simply as some kind of utilitarian object. And with such an object, the architectural object, also architecture itself appears in the world. So how does the practice of architecture appear in the world? In its cases, in its successful examples, in its successful materializations. And these materializations, just to repeat, are two in one, as I will develop in the continuation. They are not simply utilitarian objects like utilitarian public space, but are architectural objects, architectural public space. And with these examples, with these architectural objects, architecture appears in the world as a creative thinking practice. A practice that with each constructed object responds creatively to the challenges and issues of its time and place, and at the same time, and this is absolutely crucial, constructs itself anew, invents itself anew, reinvents itself. So this is actually the ultimate goal and purpose of architecture as a creative practice, the repeated reinvention of itself in the world. A reinvention in the form of various objects that it constructs and reconstructs. A useless goal, right? But so central for a human being. And I think that this is precisely what Plečnik was interested in the reinvention of architecture in the world. And I think that he really did follow these two steps as I presented. Okay, let me give you one example. So, first of all, I think that Plečnik did not, in general, approach his tasks simply as tasks that were assigned to him. And as you experts on Plečnik know, he often assigned him his own tasks that were nobody else assigned to him. In general, I would say he began with the question, what is the real task that must be addressed in that specific location, in that given case? Or what can architecture do here, do as architecture? He started with redefining the task. He turned it into an architectural task. So this first example, I will just briefly show this intervention in the Roman walls by Plečnik. You can see, those who are not from here, the plan of Roman city Emona, and the lower part I will now briefly focus on. So I think a good example of redefining the task is this project. Plečnik's project for the preservation of the walls of the ancient Roman city of Emona. In the 1920s, there was a discussion whether the walls should be preserved or they should be demolished. Plečnik fought for their preservation. In 1928, when the city decided that the walls should be restored and preserved, he was commissioned to realize this project. But instead of realizing the task of preserving the walls, he first redefined the task itself. I think that based on what he did, we can say that for him, the true question wasn't actually to preserve or to demolish, but he was interested in another question: how to transform this given space, this site of the Roman walls, into an architectural public space, an architectural and archaeological park That is a park in which architecture, including the architecture of the Roman walls, this was just part of the project, would be available to all. And the way he realized this, so in order to realize this task, he had to actually significantly intervene in these walls. He had to add some radically new interventions, such as this pyramid, for instance, these two main elements, which are pretty radical, impossible to do something like that today. This is just one example. There are many others in which Plečnik acted precisely in this way, and which is crucial. Again, he also succeeded to realize this architectural task in an architectural way, which means that he was designing spaces, elements, connections between the new and the existing, such that he was at the same time constructing architecture, introducing it into the world, materializing it in the world. In other words, he constructed his objects as architectural objects, and these are objects of a special kind. Okay, second point I will make. What are the characteristic features of every architectural object, every successful architectural solution? Before I mentioned that this object, architectural object, is the object that is two at the same time. It is, first of all, a utilitarian object. What does that mean? So it's like a house, a park, a square. It's an ordinary material object that provides the physical conditions for various activities, fulfills various functions. One of its functions is also to convey different meanings. And it is, secondly and crucially, an architectural object, a materialization of architecture in the world. And the essential thing here is that both these components, this utilitarian and architectural component, appear at the same time. That what we have to do is not with the sum of utilitarian plus architecture, but they are inseparably connected, which in short way we can say that this connection can be described as two in one. What does this mean? This simply means that if we wanted to separate these two components, we would not only destroy the object itself, but both components too. Which means, which you all know, that in architecture we never have to do with pure or bare functionality, bare utility, bare use. And, okay, I'll tell more very quickly. But we have to do with a specific use and function, which is always also something else and other than the use and function itself. We have to do with the utility that is always something other than the utility itself. It is utility to which something else belongs, the inseparable moment of architecturalness, let's call it this way. In other words, utility in architecture is the utility that is open in itself. The same holds for the dimension of meaning in architecture. An architectural object doesn't simply convey different meanings, but actually succeeds in articulating the very lack of the final meaning. Makes it, so to speak, present, and I will give an example. And it is because of this intrinsic openness, because of its open functionality, open meaning, and so on, that the architectural object addresses us in a specific way. It wants something from us, it demands something from us. This is the case for every architecture, every successful architectural object. Every architect constructs these objects, which is always a risk, whether you succeed or not, in her own way. And Plečnik, of course, did the same. And I think that there were a few points which particularly interested him in this construction. I will point to two. The time is limited, so it will be just a short sketch. The first point is concerned with function and functionality of Plečnik's architecture. The second point concerns the form and materiality. Okay, let's begin with the question of function and functionality in Plečnik's work. So Plečnik's contemporaries, the advocates of functionalism, were quite critical of Plečnik's work, especially in the 1940s. They argued, and this was their main criticism, that his architecture doesn't function well, that it isn't functional. I actually think that they missed the point. Plečnik did not ignore the question of function. He only gave this function a different emphasis. If the functionalists were interested in the function in architecture or functionality of architecture, I think that Plečnik was interested in the architectural functionality. What does this mean? This doesn't mean that he designed spaces that function poorly, but I think it's not precise enough to say that his spaces were multifunctional or that they were open to any function. His spaces always had a distinct function. They're conceived in a way that they urge us to place ourselves in them in a specific way, in the way that we activate our sensual and intellectual capacities. They require that we actively engage with them. And thus, which is essential, we, in a way, invent ourselves anew. We actually reconstruct ourselves. So let's look at one example. Now we're going to look at this Vegova Street, which is this part. This is very briefly. Okay. Okay, Vegova Street. I will focus on one segment of this street, which is, I think, incredible and particularly successful. This elevated platform in front of the National Library of Plečnik. Okay, this is the platform to which the stairs lead. But that platform leads nowhere. The ascent up to the platform is an invitation to stop, sit on the benches that are prepared there for us, and to look, observe the performance of everyday urban life in front of us, and thus to convert from the users of the street, the passers-by, into spectators. All we can in this special place that opens our view also focus on something else. But this something else is not simply some random thing. Because raised on this elevated platform, we're not simply distant observers, but we are at the same time put on display. The platform is also a stage. I think this was beautifully explored in this project by the dance group NKNAP, the project which was developed as part of Maja Vardjan's vocabulary, contemporary vocabulary project, in which they really sensed this particular dimension of this place and made it, I think, very well visible, this stage. Okay, so here in this platform or stage, we're not simply those who look. We're not simply the subjects of looking, but we are also the objects for the gaze of others. And we also see ourselves as such, as objects. This is a strange position. It creates a double distance. A distance to the world, as if we kind of stepped out of it, and a distance to ourselves, as if we kind of stepped out of ourselves and encountered ourselves as objects. This is what we become if we respond to the call of the architecture of this place. And here, I think, lies the functionality of this place, the architectural functionality. I think that Plečnik was articulating this particular kind of functionality in many projects in many different ways. This was one of his obsessions. Another obsession, and this I'm going to conclude now, and this is the second point I want to make, was the excessive, absolutely excessive articulation of the formal and material presence of architecture. What is in fact characteristic for Plečnik is what Pier Paolo Tamburelli in his book on Bramante argues that is characteristic for Italy, an unjustifiable excess of architecture, except that Plečnik did this for all. Plečnik sticks his architecture, so to speak, right under our noses. He puts his meticulously designed elements everywhere, from the public toilet to this fish market. He literally places his columns in our way, in the middle of a staircase, in the center of entrance doors and windows. His spaces and structures are excessively designed. They're too full of details, too full of elements, they're too complex, there's too much architecture in them. As a result, they require, almost force us to look, to decipher, and to ask, what is this that we see? What does this massive pyramid mean? Why is it here in contemporary Ljubljana? And why is it the way it is? I will end with this incredibly fantastic detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra, for your very and specific insights and deep ones. So now I have a pleasure to invite Nika Grabar, who is an architect that teaches at the Faculty of Architecture, and she authored the exhibition titled Plečnik, the Metropolis Place Garden, that was opened last year in the celebration of the 150th anniversary of Plečnik's birth at the City Museum in Ljubljana. So please, Nika.
Thank you, Alyosha. Thank you, Vid, for organizing this. Thank you, MAO, for having us. So today I was invited to speak because of the exhibition that took place already 2 years ago, actually. And the exhibition was entitled Plečnik, the Metropolis Place Garden. And when I was giving guided tours of the exhibition, I found it really easy to explain to people to think about the metropolis and as context for architecture, for thinking architecture. But when I was saying, let's think about place or garden as context of architecture, that was like very strange. So for me, the question is, I think it's very indicative, this situation. So how can we talk about architecture outside of the idea of the metropolis? So this was one question that I was challenging. And today I will talk about Plečnik and maybe refer to this a little bit, come back to the garden at the end. And I will not talk about Plečnik as a modernist architect, nor a postmodernist architect, even though I think these are the notions we have to develop, but as an architect that worked in a specific community of sense, and actually whose works co-shaped a specific community of sense. So I think actually it will be a bit related to Petra's presentation and of her notion of rancière. So, but when we talk about a community of sense, I just want to make sure that we understand we are not talking about a collectivity shaped by some kind of common feeling, you know. Rather, it's a community of sense which has to do with the construction of a certain framework within which subjects, things, situations can be perceived as coexisting in a common world. I will develop this a little bit further, but just, you know, a sense really has to do with a frame of visibility and intelligibility. So a community that is summoned around something that becomes visible, clear, coherent. So I think Plečnik's architecture and school were really a part of that becoming of a community of sense in a very particular moment in time, which actually transformed Ljubljana into a new political, educational, and administrative center. So it is really easy to understand this in the context of Ljubljana. Plečnik made visible past layers of the city by incorporating the ruins into a new experience of the city, which made it possible for the history of the place to have a presence in the new public space and their spatial articulations. And in doing so, architecture has as much to do with adjoining, summoning, as it has with dividing. You know, open public space, we have public institutions, we have private buildings that actually look onto the public space. And if we think about it, you know, the National Library, Križanke, and the square actually shaped forms of particular coexistence and compatibility between something given and something that was not given, something that was really imagined, framed anew, a new political and cultural reality. So the project thus shaped forms of community between the visible and intelligible, between presence and absence. So there was a sense of community in built space of that community, and at the same time, there were other senses of community framed in other spheres of experience. So I think the relation between architecture and politics is actually key for understanding Plečnik's work. And I will, again, follow the idea of communities in Rancière's terms that can be related to architecture. So the relation between art and politics, he argues, is in fact a relationship between two communities of sense. And there is no straight division line, you know, they actually overlap. And we can think about this in today's terms when we think about to which world does one fully heartedly belong and make ethical decisions in line with, and the compromises, in fact. Which master narrative is the guiding voice in the creator's head when deciding on drawing lines on paper or computer, if you will, that will create new partitions and new common experiences? Or when outlining new laws, framing coalitions, how does she organize work with whom, and under what conditions when producing space? We have to understand communities of sense as interrelated. But this also means that actually art and architecture do not make for new community of sense by their own power. They have to be grasped within a wider form of visibility and intelligibility, a wider form of fiction projection. If we are to see them as believable, really believable, we have to discern them in contribution to the procedure of meaning. We have to recognize them as meaningful. And you want that as architects, don't you? So by the time Plečnik built projects in Ljubljana, he was already a celebrated architect, having built monumental works in Vienna and Prague. He was the embodiment of the idea of the genius. Architecture was by that time definitely an autonomous discipline, and Plečnik was to make the architectural works in Ljubljana to be a part of the cultural political project. Undoubtedly, we can discern a certain politics of aesthetics at work in his replaying of forms. Think about the parliament, Tivoli, the castle, public spaces. And we can see two forces at work in his architecture, two politics of aesthetics. One resulting in autonomous work built that was really entrusted with a promise of political emancipation, freedom, equality. And on the other hand, politics of aesthetics, which gave to architecture the task of suppressing and adapting itself in the creation of new forms of collective life. So his architectural autonomy is really a part of a wider idea, linking aesthetic autonomy with political implementation of a community. Rancière actually situates the emergence of this described double bind, art and its promise of freedom and equality, and art adapting itself in the creation of new forms of collective life in a very particular historical context, namely the French Revolution. The revolution brought the end of political hierarchies, but it also overturned the meaning of art and architecture as such. And actually both are today very much contingent configurations. So the revolution, in addition to the political consequences, also meant it relinquished the power of the high classes that determined the taste, which was the power of the educated senses over the raw senses. The aesthetic experience after the revolution was to frame an equality that would be a reversal of domination. So the project of autonomy resulted in a new regime of determining what art and architecture were, which was the aesthetic regime. But also at the same time, Rancière concludes that the political revolution or the political project after the revolution in fact failed. And it failed because the revolutionary power, the state, again played the traditional part of the understanding, imposing its laws upon the matter of sensation of the masses. So what did the project of autonomy then really bring? What did it mean? Suppressed the boundaries of art and architecture, opening it up to experimentation and creating art and architecture as a separate form of human experience. Autonomy is really the result of a failed political project that continues actually to today bear traces of that promise of emancipation. Since the political project afterwards, then, after the revolution failed, the aesthetics as a separate form of human experience became actually an enduring battlefield in which notions of domination, hierarchy, high and low classes, of activity over passivity are constantly challenged. Because of the promise of the political emancipation, equality, and freedom. So actually, we have a situation that gives us an irreducible opposition between two communities of sense. One community of lived experience, the community of actually alienated life, in which art self-suppresses, and then the community of aesthetic experience with a promise of emancipation, but which is separate from the everyday life, guarding itself from commercialization. Architecture of Plečnik was conditioned by the political and cultural project. In it, we can actually read precisely the collision of the two politics of sensoriality, playing on the boundary and the absence of that boundary of the autonomy of architecture, opening the field to formal and material experimentation, and, on the other hand, intervening the everyday as architect from the autonomous sphere of architecture, adapting to the political and cultural situation. So, the exhibition on Plečnik was really about elucidating different contexts for architecture, and most notably to go away from the idea of the genius architect. Yes, he was entrusted with autonomy as a professional, and he did replay just about everything he could creatively master, as you can see, and the list is really long. And we can actually see how his work changed from Vienna to Prague to Ljubljana, and actually it very much adapted to the new social reality so that it could be grasped by the taste of the local community. So the frame he imagined, what could be imagined, was made possible by the community that actually was on the side of the municipality. But on the other side, there was a community he knew as an architect and a citizen of Ljubljana and wanted to evolve further. A community of the craftsmen, church communities, community with students, farmers, a situation that many times created problems for him. Community of sense that his architecture co-shaped was at the same time indebted to the autonomy of architecture as a modern project of spatial articulations, and at the same time to political strivings that again repeated the same failure as the revolution, trying to assert notions of states through the hierarchies of the state and municipality. So which is the one characteristic, and with this I will try to conclude, of his architecture I would like to stress most? And I will go back to the exhibition. Plečnik thought of Ljubljana as a garden, something that cannot be completely controlled, something that is related to nature, for the community, an emancipated community. So Plečnik's gift to the emerging new community of sense with architecture was influenced by a critique of what he had experienced in the context of modernizing metropolis of Vienna and Prague. This ethical stance made him rethink buildings so that democratization of the church, giving gardens to families, understanding the capital and as an interweaving of topography with water and greenery and ruins of the past would be possible. However, this was not on the agenda of the municipality then, and it is not today. This was and is not on a program of the municipality or the state. It was a community of a different sense that framed that vision. With Plečnik's architecture, we can see an emergence of a new condition of a double bind of the autonomy with a promise of political and cultural emancipation, politics of aesthetics which gave way to architecture, which gave the architecture the task of adapting itself in the creation of new forms of collective life. So communities of sense gather and organize around ideas, call it fiction, not for the sake of the invention of an imaginary world for its own sake, but rather as a construction of a framework within which subjects, things, situations can be perceived as coexisting in a common world, and events can be identified and linked in a way that makes sense. Rancière would put it, fiction is at work whenever a sense of reality must be produced. Architecture is very much a part of that story. If we understand fiction as a precondition of architecture, and metropolis only a part of that fiction, and if garden was fiction Plečnik designed for us to continue seeing, what would it mean to turn it into a project for the community of sense, entrusting architecture with a promise of political freedom, equality, sustainability, so that it could adapt to co-shape a new form of life? And on the other hand, how can architecture as an autonomous sphere make visible the clash between different communities of sense, a productive, creative clash that renders visible the layers of reality meaningful for future creations of the world? Plečnik imagined Ljubljana would have 500 gardeners employed, that every family would have a garden to grow vegetables. In the case of new urbanization of Bežigrad, many trees were planted. The gardens of Krakow were preserved, and public spaces were an intertwinement with the landscaped greenery in parks. Who constitutes today the communities of sense that could grasp the reality of Plečnik's garden? And my last question would be, can they co-shape the idea of architecture? Thank you.
Thank you, Nika. Does this work? Yeah. Thank you, Nika. Now it's again my pleasure to introduce Maja Vardjan, an architect and curator of architecture. She is, as you know, the director of the Museum of Architecture and Design, this institution, and author of many groundbreaking exhibitions that promote Slovenian architecture in design at home and abroad. So Maja Vardjan at her curatorial best.
Well, thank you, Alyosha. You're exaggerating a bit, but okay, thank you. Just a second. I will speak about Plečnik's work in a rather unusual way. I will present it with terms, with words or phrases proposed by experts from various disciplines for exhibition project that I curated in City Museum in Ljubljana, the City Museum that also manages Plečnik's house and the main Plečnik's archive. So on the occasion of 150th anniversary of the birth of Jože Plečnik, the City Museum of Ljubljana was organizing a comprehensive exhibition that Nika presented in a way. It opened 2 years ago, and this exhibition included a smaller independent project based on a contemporary reflections on Plečnik's work. Its starting point was the topicality of Plečnik's architecture and urbanism for the present day. And as you see, this project was a collaboration of 2 museums and 3 curators, and Tomaž Štoka is also with us today. So we heard that Plečnik was a unique architect, and we know that it is on a global scale. His works are some of the most original and specific examples in 20th century architecture, which are impossible to place in any architectural movements. And as you see from the presentations today, they also provide an exceptional number of reference points for the present time. And their actuality is constantly growing and evolving in the light of current social, economic, and cultural changes. When I was invited to create the project as additional layer of a central exhibition, I was considering many possible formats, and I finally proposed a hybrid between exhibition and a publication. And what I have to stress is that this project was conceived as an experiment. Its aim was to create a glossary that will address Plečnik's work through the responses of contemporary practitioners and theorists. And their task was to highlight, in the format defined by the structure of the exhibition, the term that they consider essential for understanding the Plečnik today. Why glossary? If we want to talk about Plečnik from a critical position of today, we need to invent new terminology. While in the past, discussions of Plečnik's oeuvre were full of terms or vocabularies that many researchers and authors assembled from the perspective of their own specific cultural, social, and political context, the glossary proposes an entirely new word stock aimed at actualizing and understanding Plečnik's in the current context. So how do we think, interpret, and live Plečnik today? And this question triggered a set of relevant positions on Plečnik's extensive creative production. We asked different authors, architects, artists, curators, designers, philosophers, landscape architects to propose a term, its definition, and a visual contribution that captured this. So we were interested in contributions based on intellectual positions, as well as on the intuitive curiosity of the invited authors, that could focus either on the context of their own project, but also on a broader discourse. And this is the actual exhibition, or one of its corners, to be precise. So in search of an appropriate relationship between the content and the display, we decided that the glossary is displayed as a set of words and definitions on a 3-dimensional gray plates that were the core of the exhibition, the main element of the exhibition display, and which together, then by additional illustrations, photographs, variety of objects, created a kind of spatial constellation of diverse ideas that, when they're put together, create new relations and stimulate new terms and interpretations with each visitor. So many speakers of today collaborated, in fact, in this project. Boštjan Vuga with porosity, I believe you will hear about this later, Dekleva-Gregorič arhitekti with materiality, Petra Čeferin with gigantic joints. But since you will hear their positions today, I decided to focus on 6 or perhaps 7, depends on the time, other terms that differently relate to the public sphere. This is Vegova Street in Ljubljana that you've already seen and perhaps visited today. And this street Plečnik transformed into a kind of hybrid between the street and the park. So the architect created its composition by gradually adding smaller elements and connecting them into the whole. The situation was a starting point for Belgian architect Radim Lauda and photographer Maxime Delvaux, who proposed the term assemblage. So let's take a look at what is happening here, or perhaps here will be a better, you will see better. So we see the head of the composers that rest semi-cantilevered on a stone pillar. The trees kind of eat the back of their heads. And these sculptures are placed on a masonry plinth that can be used as a public bench. But this bench extends into the park with a promenade above. And what you cannot see on the image are entrances of the buildings at the background that are all addressed differently. And we could go on describing this situation. All these relations between different objects and places that are connected by the master's plan represent, and I quote, a way of thinking about architecture as a relational object, a narrative assemblage that offers constantly renewed experiencing and understandings of the space, end of quote. So they're pointing out Plečnik's mechanisms, his approaches rather than his aesthetic, and thus celebrate the relational and complex in the public space. And Vegova Street is a prime example how Plečnik builds complexity. Another term that strongly resonated in the exhibition was the imagination by landscape architect Ana Kučan. She compares Plečnik's work to a garden as heterotopia, that is, I quote, maintained in communication and tension between nature and culture, the corporeal and the spiritual, the real and imagined. A garden is in its essence and anti-utilitarian, a space for the imaginary. For Ana Kučan, imagination and anti-utilitarianism are subjects that open up a political dimension in Plečnik's work. Because in our current society, that's very important, because everything must be so useful. Plečnik's project, and this is Trnovok Way, a part of Plečnik's regulation of Ljubljanica River, remain open for interpretation. Plečnik's project opened up new possibilities. Kučan writes, and I quote again, a time when the authorities fervently prescribe and define everything, this openness is subversive. An anti-utilitarianism is the new radical, and imagination the tool with which we can bring back our freedom. So Plečnik therefore creates spaces that are undefined, spaces for imagination of freedom. The open public space was also a starting point for artist Maruša Sagadin. While Sagadin talks about her relationship to Plečnik, her term was body-body, she also thematizes the feminine principles against the masculine powers in creation of urban space. Maruša is an architect and sculptor that intervenes in public spaces with playful and humorous elements that are also conceived as harsh criticism of rigidity of urban space. In fact, she wrote a rap song because she said this is the only way she can communicate with a great master, because when she raps, she feels more powerful and daring. Let me read a part of her piece. I will read it, not rap it. She says, he dominates the city. Urban planning was the exclusive domain of men. He builds bridges. I sneak into the city landscape, and I transform domesticity and femininity into public infrastructure. So despite different positions and starting points, Sagadin and Plečnik built public space by carefully thought of compositional wholes, always keeping in mind that urban space are intended as places where everything can happen. We are both crazy about human scale, raps Marusha. And this is one of her sketches that were glued in the paper column. That's the sculpture she built for the exhibition. Speaking about Plečnik and public space, one cannot miss the term resourcefulness, brought up by design curator Jane Withers, that according to her, in Plečnik's case, take many forms, including social, economic, and not just material resourcefulness. She also describes the fourth dimension that could be described as creative resourcefulness, which I think is very important when speaking about Plečnik. So she chose example of St. Michael's Church in Barje, where she was embracing what we now call collective construction methods, because Plečnik engaged the local community to help in creating this economical building. The four massive concrete pillars are repurposed sewage pipes. They were polished by locals over the winter month to prepare the smooth surface for painting. The sculptural chandeliers were assembled from various parts, including horns, drinking glasses, Turkish coffee grinders, and other household items. And this kind of resourcefulness you can also find in Ljubljana's urban spaces. This is the stairway of the church. So, connected to this is a term participation that was proposed by the artist Marjetica Potrč. In 1944, the architect Jože Plečnik proposed the project Houses Under the Municipal Roof to the city of Ljubljana. The city would construct a large canopy roof and provide a communal infrastructure for a neighborhood, and the residents would build their houses under this common roof. The proposal articulated a way to grow a city in partnership with its citizens. Thus, Plečnik joined architects such as Jona Friedman, Le Corbusier, or Alejandro Aravena, who similarly proposed alternative housing solutions based on the participation of residents. Here you see a drawing by Plečnik's student and a drawing of Marjetica Potrč about Plečnik's approach to the city with a plan to provide a space for settler under the common roof. And for the end, I would like to highlight Plečnik as socially responsible architect, even as activist, as Miloš Kosset suggests in his term activism. Kosset stressed that a true architect has an ability to occasionally stop and decide not to build. Plečnik, with his numerous realized and unrealized projects, is an example of a practice-oriented designer. But we also know of documents that testify that Plečnik sometimes operated with words instead of drawings. In his letter to Mayor of Ljubljana, he urged to save the cities, the towns, Roman walls from the destruction, as Petra mentioned in her presentation. So here he was, in fact, not as a builder and designer as he was commonly known, but he put himself forward as a critical activist for public space and the heritage. And this is, in fact, next to the plate is the Plečnik's letter to the mayor from 1934 and the open letter in Delo newspaper written by today's activists fighting to save an open Plečnik stadium. So we try to create this friction between different moments of the past and the present. So in fact, activism has been a way of creating, preserving, and occupying the public space in the past and also today. So to conclude, the aim of this experimental project was to create an open vocabulary that could constitute a frame of reference for a new contemporary discourse on Plečnik's architecture, based on a subjective and critical reflection on Plečnik's work. As you saw, the responses, there were many more, extend well beyond an established and conventional understanding of Plečnik as a key personality, as the great author in the history of Slovenian and European architecture. But we are speaking here about the inventive interpretations that highlight first and foremost the conceptual potential in his projects for the present day and forward into the future. So rather than a thing of the past, his work and approaches are interpreted as a dynamic and provocative sources of new ideas, projects, and vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Maja, for giving us this vocabulary with which we can discuss today Plečnik. And it's my pleasure to invite to the stage and introduce Boštjan Vuga, an architect of a leading Slovenian architectural practice, Sadar+Vuga Architects. He regularly teaches at international institutions of architecture, most recently at the AA in London. And he is also a president of Plečnik's Foundation. So, Boštjan, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Alyosha. Thank you, Vid. Thank you, everyone, for kind of inviting me here and spending, I think that it will be 16.5 minutes, you know, with this presentation, which is actually giving, I mean, I will actually speak about the same thing, but from a different point of view. And I will actually speak from the point of view of a practitioner. So actually, I mean, I'm kind of like trying to sort of convey, in a way, like my observation of Plečnik work in a kind of like, I would say, maybe even like instruction manual, which would actually help you to sort of see the work, observe the work, and then transform that into another thing, you know. Yeah. Anyway, so I will start with porosity. So the first slide, which we just passed, you know, was a slide of a bone, of a structure of the bone. And one can ask, you know, what has the structure of the bone do with the public space of Plečnik in Ljubljana? You know? The connection are the boundaries, you know, like the porous boundaries. And here I'm giving actually this definition of porosity. And I will try to kind of connect porosity as a sort of measure of the void, like the physical term, measure of the void, space in the physical matter, to architecture porosity, to the boundaries. So architecture porosity is defined by the character of the boundaries you can read here, between the site and the build, between the exterior and interior, and between and even in the build structure itself. And I'm jumping now to the effect of these porous spaces. So the porous spaces can actually generate, support, and enhance publicness. And this is where we are back to Plečnik. So Plečnik work, and this is my observation, Plečnik work is a pure example of porosity in architecture. So if you now go back to this bone marrow and sort of try to make this from abstract to more concrete, you know, this kind of like mental, or as Peter put it, like creative shift, the boundaries of Plečnik work are porous boundaries. And then you see here these intervals between columns and arcades, different ratios, different openings, different kind of character of the boundaries. And this is interesting because, the boundaries, Plečnik boundaries itself are actually, source of kind of endless attraction, provocation, play and humor. I mean, something doesn't work, it's kind of different as we expected, and that's why we're so attracted to that, And I'm making this kind of strong statement that the more porous an object of architecture is, the more inclusive and more open and more kind of fresh, if you allow me to use this word, is impact on different audiences. The more inclusive is the public space. So the porous spaces are for the individual experience and are to stimulate the public activities. So we have like the individual perception, and this is where you are, so you go there and perceive, But then you will see the effect of that is, how public actually participate in that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually take you to, the Plečnik's arcade in the marketplace. The marketplace. And then by trying to kind of read what you see on this photo, try to kind of present what we were stimulated as, the office or, in the office, we were stimulated with when creating or when conceiving, conceptualizing a project, which I'm also going to put in this presentation. Okay, so we are in the center of Ljubljana. We are, this is next to 3 bridges, it's like the point, And then this is sequence number 1. I'm going to kind of take you through several sequences, and this is sequence number 1. And what you see here is Plečnik work of the arcades, of the beginning of the market. Started with the small pavilion, we can call it the kiosk, And this is placed in front of the, late 19th century, early 20th century palace, which is behind. But what is important here, and this is where I start to read that, is how to kind of shift that perception of arches and columns into something which is kind of quite more essential. So I read this as 3 levels: the roof level, the street or the market level, and the river level. And these 3 levels will actually continue through all the sequences. And then what you read here more are these 2 boundaries with 2 different porosities. So the lower one is much more enclosed with arches, and the upper one, 2 sets of colonnades. It's open, much more open, kind of providing sort of foreground for the building behind. We continue, and this sort of longitudinal kind of repetition, sort of we go along, it's a dimension of the repetition, creates a very strong effect. So we are following the same spatial configuration. 3 levels and 2 sets of boundaries. The building is still has a strong background, But then we have a sudden change. So what was open and actually enables like continuation into the background, it's close, becomes kind of much more enclosed, and the 2 boundaries, 2 sets of boundaries are kind of flattened, if I use this word, into one wall. But this wall actually still has like 3 levels. You can still read like the river level, the market level, and the roof. And the sort of the arches from below, move above and so on. continue. This is the sequence number 4. And the sequence number 4 is kind of, we can call it like a break, you know. It's the break in this sort of longitudinal repetitive development. And this break, it's something which it's, let's call it like, I wouldn't say like a strange, but it's unusual. Why to break? Why to break this discontinuity? To break it with something which, you know, you can call it like the loggia. So the loggia where the city would actually get to the river. And the loggia, we see here again, you know, still has like 3 levels. The river level, the market level, and the roof. And then we are in the loggia. So the loggia, you know, why to have the loggia? You know? The loggia is kind of like a different space between the two kind of enclosed volumes on both sides. And here in this loggia, I mean, this is what I'm referring here to what Petra said before, we have again the excess, I wouldn't say of the form, but excess of the structure. So the number of columns, does not need to kind of, does not correspond to the structure need, the structure performance of the space. It's kind of like an effect. It's an effect of the porous boundary, in effect which actually define the space of the loggia. And this is now, we move back and we see actually the loggia from a distance, from the public space of the market, of the open air market. And this public space of the open air market actually flies or is smoothly transitioned into the space of the river. And the loggia itself becomes kind of like the window from which, you know, we can actually connect both spaces. So we are now in the market, or we are now on the market ground. We move back in the same direction as we see it from the other side of the embankment. And we see here, you know, that to that building, to that wall, which was actually then thickened and became a building, another layer was added, another kind of boundary, you know. And this boundary of the colonnades actually creates a very distinctive space, you know. It creates like a space which again is a different space, a transitional space between the space of the market and the enclosed space of the building. So the space is actually the space of the archives, and you use this space when, you know, if it is like too sunny or too rainy or too windy, you know, it's an interstitial space between the extreme exterior and between interior. Okay, again, you know, like the beams are too high, you know, the columns are, you know, like too close, you know, but all this in a space, in a way, you know, as Petra put it, you know, to create kind of like architecture functionality, or to create kind of architecture effect, or to create like a different set of porous spaces. I super like this sequence because it's completely, you know, one would say it's completely wrong, you know, why would you have like a, you know, like a colonnade which would not then continue, like the front one, which would not then continue to the lower colonnade at the back, but there was an interruption. So let's say that if you walk there, you know, and it's rainy, you go there and then you step from the shelter to the rain to get back to the shelter. You know. I really like that also, you know, because these two sequences actually show like the clash or contradiction between the two boundaries. You know. And if I continue, you know, so we are now in the space of these two set of porous boundaries we saw from the beginning, which has, you know, again, which has two ends. So it's again like a kind of longitudinal loggia. You know, it's kind of kept between the two solid buildings, solid walls on both sides. Very interesting, because when you walk there and then you think about these spaces, it's like really sequential movement and observation. It's the way one can actually learn from Plečnik. And then at this very moment, you go down. You go down, because you go from the market level to the river level, and you go down to something which is a spatial opulence. It's kind of like another sort of like a mini pavilion. It's like another space, house in the house, within that porous boundaries. So when you walk down these stairs, it's kind of like a reminiscent, let's say, to Bramante in Vatican. When you walk down this space, you walk in a very, very, very specific sequence. You walk down, and then you have completely different spatial settings on both sides. Very austere, very kind of, it looks kind of like a monofunctional space. It looks like, once I'm here, I need to do something. I need to kind of open this door and I enter. And then I enter to the fish market. And I enter to a very sort of sterile, cold, fishy smelling space, but very close to the river. And this is very sort of compressed space. From the very kind of open space of the market, like defined by the loggia. All this what I have already explained. You move down, and you are in enclosed space of the fish market with a view to the river. And this is where it comes my favorite space. So it's actually this sort of strange in-between, sort of, we're kind of down in the lower level of the loggia. And you see here, the sort of play, or, like the way how he structured these porous boundaries. So you can just quickly walk through, and you would not even see the river because of the thickness of the pilaster, or you sit down on this bench, and then you view to the river. So these two very, very ambiguous space. Anyway, so we could have sort of continue like describing and observing Plečnik's interventions in the city like that, to a very sort of like a basic spatial volumetric, I would not even say like a formal or architectural language principle. And here I would like to introduce, how this reading could actually become a starting point for the project, which is actually placed here, the Butcher's Bridge. So you see here on the elevation above, a very sort of longitudinal repetition of the market building, and then the second break in between, and then in the middle break in the between. And in this middle break, this project was actually supposed to place his proposal for the Butcher's Bridge. What is interesting here? Again, we have like a very porous space of the building. And it's not a bridge, but it's a house or temple in this case on the water. It's very interesting shift, to kind of also structure. It's not like it's overdone. It's like it's an abundance of everything. Which creates this ambiguity and allows for different usage. So this project was not built, and then, 15 years ago or 14 years ago, there was a competition announced here by the chamber, to actually design a proposal for the bridge. And I will show you our proposal, our competition entry, which again was influenced not just by reading the marketplace, the Plečnik market, but also by this interesting structure. So you see again, the structure here in the crypt, one of his very early projects, is the structure which creates like an open grid. So we have the light from above, and then the gridded columns, which then touch the ground. So why is that? Why was that interesting for us? So we try to shift that, have this sort of like two kind of spaces, the lower and the upper, and propose a structure, a porous structure with 3 waffle slabs, and this sort of like stalactites and stalagmites columns which sort of connects and make this sort of a stiff, a rigid object, which is then developed and somehow placed there on the side. Similar as the Plečnik bridge could be done. So again, you see 3 levels: the river or the embankment, the market, and the roof. The roof is higher up, to kind of sort of overpass the roof of the markets, and 2 completely different spaces. So here, this is the continuation of the space of the fishmongers, of the fish market, very narrow, very compressed, and which could be used, again, could be used or is allow for usage of the, let's say, stalls and market. And then you have the space above, like the continuation of the loggia. So a loggia again, but completely different, So the loggia which extends into the bridge. The loggia actually which extends into the balcony on the river. So imagine that you're on the bridge, but the bridge actually ends up with a balcony, so that you cannot walk down. So it's a complete sort of deny of the function of the bridge. So if you want to go down, you need to step back and use this circular ramp to actually go down to the embankment, or even continue down to the river. So here, everything is kind of develop or try to be developed with a sort of similar thinking as derived from, let's say, understanding or observation of Plečnik. So the house of the water has structure which is set back from the perimeter of the bridge. The circulation is not circulation of the end. Circulation, you cannot step down at the end, but you need to go back and then go down. It's actually all these architectural elements are actually elements of the building, of the house of the water. So I want to end it here. I want to end here, with this sort of going back to the colonnades, to this sort of like 2 different sets of porous layers, and claiming, that understanding and why the Plečnik is actually so rich for, let's say, practitioners. It's because of spatial settings, because of sequential settings. And for instance, in the National Gallery, this is the center part of the National Gallery, this over-exaggerated repetition of steel frames kind of are there to kind of create this cinematic experience. When you move in a different way, you move kind of slower, you see like the sitting on one side, park on the other side, and depending on your angle and viewpoint, the colonnades would actually sort of compress into more continuous wall or open up. And again, this space, it's used for many different events. So it's a public space which structure, architecture, dimensional, material, I wouldn't even say like volumetric, allows for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Boštjan, for proactive practitioners for the Plečnik's works. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the last speaker of today's symposium. So Aleš Vodopivec is a practicing architect and a long-lasting professor of architecture at the Faculty of Architecture here in Ljubljana. He's one of best educators of architecture in the country, who brought up decades of generations of architects, including myself and many others here in this room. So Aleš, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Alyosha, for this kind invitation and the introduction. Okay, look, you've heard a lot today. In 15 minutes, it's very hard to say something serious about Plečnik, because I believe there are a lot of stories and lectures one can learn from him. And I finally decided, when I was asked to participate, to talk just about two lessons that were very important for me. And the first one is that Plečnik was a very independent artistic personality. And I think that's something, it's really important for, at least for young architects, but something that is really very hard to achieve. And the second lecture, the second part of the lecture, or the second theme, would be that I live in this city over 70 years. I was born in Ljubljana, and I believe it's a real privilege to live in a city like that, because of the generosity of his architecture, of Plečnik's architecture, of course. Yeah. I think it was very important that his works in Ljubljana were put on this World Heritage List, UNESCO. I'm very grateful to the colleagues who did this, because this means that the qualities of his architecture in Ljubljana were internationally recognized. And why I think that is so important, because it was not like that in the past, you know. 50 years ago, when I studied architecture in this city, in Ljubljana, I didn't hear one lecture on Plečnik. He was criticized, he was completely forgotten, I would say. Many of his works were neglected, even in decay. This is a recent photo, so there are still works like that of him. And that I found very strange, because you know, the most respected architectural historians and critics agreed that he was, as they said, as they claimed, modern in Vienna, that in Prague he was mature. You know that later after moving from Vienna, he moved to Prague. While his works in Ljubljana were, I quote, nothing more than monumental. Can you imagine? 35 years ago, people still claim like that. So now today, it's on the heritage list of UNESCO. How come? That, as I said, the most respected art historians and critics of architecture didn't find any qualities in his works of Ljubljana except their monumentality. And even that had quite a negative connotation. And I believe that it's a very simple answer to that question. Because according to their judgment, you know, his architecture was outdated. It didn't express, or the works in Ljubljana, according to them, didn't express the spirit of the age, the so-called Zeitgeist. Zeitgeist was very important for art historians to judge architecture of the 20th century. And they rejected his classicism, as they saw it as a sign of anachronism. They criticized his works as Plečnik did not follow, the trends of modernist architects. And that's this important message I learned from him. Because Plečnik wasn't an architect influenced, by his contemporaries. He was a totally independent artistic personality, really an architectural loner, I would say, whose work stand isolated from the trends of the profession. And that's something which I think is a message for young generation, as I said, so important, because today you are daily attacked with that many images on your smartphone, on your computer, and so it's very hard to avoid not to be affected by trendy architecture, I would say. Plečnik was also, I simplify a little bit because of the limited time, was critical towards the international character of modernist architecture. His view of architecture was just the opposite, because when he returned to Ljubljana in the early 20s, he was strongly influenced, by the pro-national mood of the Slovenes. It was the first time you would need to understand that this was for the first time in history that Slovenes were united with other Slavic nations in a state. Before they were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on. And so he was not naive. He didn't attempt to invent a Slovenian architectural style, but he was looking for a Mediterranean character of the city, how to find an atmosphere, an architectural atmosphere of the city that would be different from the German-speaking world, or the architecture of the German-speaking world. So according to him, classical architecture served as kind of a metaphor for Mediterranean tradition. And it's a real paradox that Plečnik architecture seemed outdated, as I said, even 35 years ago, but it is not outdated today. So obviously Plečnik's architecture has somehow lost its temporal dimension. And here I like this quote because in a way it explains this. I don't know if you are familiar with the name Richard de Marco. He's a Scottish artist, a promoter of art, and in an interview he gave this answer. Works of a genius transcend the limitations of style and period. They are universal for all human beings and all times. And so reflecting, the spirit of the age or following the global trends today of our time, has nothing to do with the real qualities of art or of architecture. And Plečnik was, just the opposite. He was faithful to his own culture, the space where he built differently in Ljubljana than from what he did in Prague and different from what he did in Vienna. But most of all, he was faithful to himself. And I think this is kind of a precondition for a real important artwork. Just to end this, I would just like to show you this project, which is a tombstone, gravestone, that Plečnik did for his brother Andrej, which is so surprisingly ascetic if you compare it to the works he did at the same time in Ljubljana. It was done, as you see, in 1931. And this shows, in a way, that style was far less important for him than for those critics who criticized his work. Because this was an intimately, probably the most important work for him. His brother Andrej was a priest, and as probably you know, Plečnik had no family. So after his father died, this story is quite known, that his brother Andrej became kind of an intimate personal confidant of the architect. So I would say the most painful grief he expressed with this kind of architecture. There's no trace of classical language anymore, It's kind of an eternal power of pure art, I would say. Just a stone monolith. It's not about the form anymore. You cannot do any formal analysis of this work. And it's strange, that you don't find this project, you can hardly find one in any of the books on Plečnik, because those biographers don't see anything in it. But I think it's, on the other side, it's a very important it's a very important project because it shows that the idea and the concept are more important probably than the forum itself, or at least more than the style. And obviously Plečnik understood that. So the second lesson I would like to talk about, or the second message that was so important for me, are the qualities of his works in Ljubljana that were not recognized, as I say. You know, Ljubljana was a very small provincial city when he came in the early 20s. A provincial city of the former monarchy, without any special character or atmosphere or anything. And what he did, he managed really, in 2 decades, to turn this city, this provincial city of small scale. It has about 60,000, 50 to 60,000 inhabitants, so 5 times, 6 times less than it is now, you know. He managed to turn it into a national capital with a unique character. And what is even more surprising for me, we've already seen this plan, that his urban design has nothing to do with the contemporary, you know, urban planning of a city. You don't see any, you know, all these analyses that we are using today to urbanize a city. He urbanized Ljubljana with architectural projects, just with that. And just recently I read an article, an interesting article, a good article, or how can I say, I like it a lot, on architecture, where I found a statement that a beautiful city is a symphony of beautiful buildings, or great buildings. But what is surprising with Plečnik, he did, at least in the city center, only 3 important buildings. All the rest were just interventions into public spaces. You know, he did the library, the market that we've seen now, and the third one is an insurance company building. All the rest, the cemetery, the churches, are outside the city center. But he turned completely the atmosphere of the city, with public spaces, like squares, like parks, bridges, embankments, also with staircases, ramps, and so on. So these are the places where people can meet, where they socialize, entertain, when they change ideas, and so on. The most important places for urban life. And his works are really based on a surprising dialogue between, you know, the new and the old, small scale and large scale, public, private, built and greenery. And so he didn't make isolated interventions, which was common in the books of modern architecture. If you look at the books of modern architecture, you see that there are isolated objects. For him, that was not important, you know, to do any isolated object that screamed, look at me, look at me. He was on the contrary, he was looking for opportunities to create new spaces, you know, new open spaces and connections in the existing. Mostly in dialogue, like this small intervention in between these 2 buildings, mostly in dialogue with the anonymous built structures. We've seen many of these images before. But what I want to stress is that each concept of his architecture is based on a broader context of the environment, you know, of the existing environment. And every work of architecture has a function to design the city as well, you know, his architectural ideas and concepts stem from the characteristics of the place. In a way, I could say that every one of his projects is kind of his own personal story or an interpretation of the spirit of the place. If I have time enough, I can just show 3 bridges to tell you what I mean with this. You know, there's 3 different bridges, I mean. The first one is the very known, you know, 3 bridges that we've already seen. And the original concept derives from the idea that or let's say the assignment of the city authorities of the time that the old bridge, the middle bridge is an old stone bridge, that it was too narrow for the increased traffic, and they wanted to demolish it. And his original idea and the concept of the 3 bridges is how to keep, you know, the old bridge, because he liked it. So he solved the problem by putting these 2 footbridges on both sides. And the second bridge is the Trnovo Bridge, another example, you know, which is very unique. I've never seen. There are trees planted on the bridge, and at the edges you have, on the corners you have also pyramids, because it's not only a bridge, but it's at the same time, you know, a square in front of the church, because most churches have square in front. This one didn't have it before, where people can meet before or after the mass and so on. And so he did also this square, which I said had pyramids, as you see, on the corners and trees. Unfortunately, this photo was taken when the trees were just removed with the smaller one. The older one were too big. And the last one, the Shoemaker's Bridge, which again is a bridge, but at the same time is a small marketplace with stalls. But why? Because in the Middle Ages, on the bridge there were small shops, you know, kind of sale sheds. So as a memory of this, he somehow offered this opportunity to make it again kind of a small marketplace. So with his interventions, he created new public spaces, as I said, of very different character, you know, for a wide variety of purposes, of experiences, from the more, let's say, representative examples like the Congress Squares and the park, the Zvezda Park, then again the market complex with the three bridges, and finally this one that I like so much, you know, one of the embankments. He did plenty of them, but with this one, he did, according to my judgment, I would say the most lyrical area of the city. So to end this presentation, I would say that he managed to connect, you know, stories of the past with various stylistic periods of Ljubljana into a harmonious whole, which is really something extraordinary. His architecture in Ljubljana is extremely generous, I think, as everybody, you know, regardless of age, personal sensitivity, interest, or mood, can find a space for himself. And for that reason, I think it's really a privilege to live in this city. I hope you will understand it when you will spend 2 weeks here. I'm afraid it's not that much as it was a decade ago, this privilege, but that's another story. I wouldn't go into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Aleš, for this thought-provoking and brilliant, as always, presentation, also up to date. So yeah, that was a very good conclusion of today's set of presentations. So we are going to continue after 10 minutes of break with a discussion with all panelists, where I have the privilege to introduce my colleague Vit Žnidaršič, who is doing together with me in organizing this AA Nanotourism visiting school, a young architect based in London and working in London, but also I'm proud to say the first generation of AA visiting school in 10 years ago. So Vit, thank you for your next intervention, and let's see everybody in this hall in 10 minutes. Thanks.
Ana, se slišimo? Ana. Hey everyone. Hi everyone. Hey everyone. Welcome back. May I first invite all the speakers to join me? Ah, they're here. Everyone's here. Petra. Ah, hi. Okay, thank you. First of all, hi everyone. Thank you, Alyosha, for a generous introduction and co-organizing this. And thank you, everyone, for inspiring set of talks and thought-provoking presentations. And I'm looking forward to a bit of a discussion now. So in terms of the format, I would suggest that maybe I start with a few prompts, and then we respond the way we see fit, or maybe I'll address someone if I feel very strongly about it. And then afterwards, I would really invite everyone here amongst the audience to participate as well and ask questions, and let's open the debate to a wider forum. So maybe as a start, I would start with a thought that we put forward in the abstract that we shared and the invitation, which is sort of reconciliation with contemporality. And I think that what Maja kind of touched on with her glossary is a starting point for that, and it addresses it. But I wonder what is particularly relevant these days, and I guess this is a question for everyone, but maybe more importantly, what became obsolete in Plečnik's work? Because I think there is something interesting about the temporal dimension, and that Aleš also mentioned, and we can touch on that later. But in the context of, let's say, tourism, globalization, neoliberal condition that we live in, how does Plečnik's work navigate that? And what in Plečnik's work we can refer to as contemporary, and what maybe is not that relevant anymore that he was addressing? Maja, would you like to maybe start? Because I think that your glossary is really, really interesting in those terms.
I would say that I will speak from my perspective as an architect, curator, and researcher of the 20th century architecture and contemporary practices as well, that the question what is obsolete is constantly, I mean, it's for me not relevant, and it's constantly changing, because you always look at the history from a new perspective, from a kind of critical position of today. So something that in fact could be considered obsolete in one moment is interesting in another moment. So it's a constant flux, you know. So in fact, I cannot answer this question, what is obsolete in Plečnik, because I don't want to think about Plečnik's work from this perspective. I really believe that looking into the past of architecture or archives, architecture archives and projects, you could always dig in them from different points and then rearrange this and build kind of, use it as a kind of production thing to rethink it. And the question of obsolete is, yeah, as I said, constantly changing, being there, not being there. It's like with an archive, you know. Sometimes you find in archives a postcard or something that you find obsolete and irrelevant, but if you look at it from another point of view, it could tell you really a lot. So that's why I want to distance from like...
I think this is great, because I think that then it leads us to the next question of what is then in this point of time particularly relevant? Or if we extract it, because I think we spoke about Plečnik's work in, let's say, quite general terms. But if we stop for a second in this moment of time, how does Plečnik address current, let's say, a situation that Ljubljana has found itself in?
I can maybe say something. So I would just first respond also to the first question that you opened and what Maja said. I think it is very very interesting that I think that any work of a human being is a response to a particular time and place. It's better or worse response, but good responses are those that break that time and place, so that they become visible, let's say. They appear in their contemporaneity. And as Maja said, I agree that you can keep seeing this contemporaneity in different times. You know, 1930s, then suddenly 70s, then 2024. Which is characteristic for any artwork and architectural work. And I think that we do not have a final answer why at that particular moment. So in case of Plečnik, I think that it's not a coincidence that today we see him again as relevant. So your question is, I think, very relevant. What is one dimension maybe, well, which I find particularly relevant and I try to show, is this extended or open functionality. This is something which architecture can do, which means that addresses a person as in her generic capacity of seeing, thinking, a sensuous ability, you know. So Plečnik developed this in a particular way and consistently and in an excellent way. So he introduced, I think, to refer to Maja's presentation, she said everything has to be useful today. I think he was really good in breaking this usefulness. And that's why I think this is one of the reasons why he's contemporary. His forms, however, cannot be applied today, I think.
I think this is a really interesting point. And maybe, Boštjan, this is a question for you. I remember in one of the lectures in the past, and I think this is what you were hinting at with your bridge project as well, is this idea of sort of like sneaking in something else, that the brief asks for something, while the ability, I guess what Petra is saying, is that you redefine the question that you've been asked. And I think in the work that you do, that's quite often the case. But I was wondering if you want to maybe expand on, you know, if there's a particular moment that in Plečnik's work that you see as a springboard for concepts and you know, how that kind of influences also the thinking about porosity and boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's. I mean, I think that you cannot. What is actually really interesting, that you cannot write, draw, you know, conceive or develop an instruction manual for Plečnik. I mean, you cannot even draw diagrams. You know, like, I mean, you can draw diagrams of Gropius, you can draw diagrams of Le Corbusier, you know, you can draw diagrams even of Mies, but of Plečnik, drawing architecture diagrams, it's not really useful, you know. So why? You know, because this is where the shift happens, you know. And the shift actually happens in and this is my personal observation, in those elements or in those sequences where Plečnik is the most heretic. You know, like if you take church on Bari, on Marshland, you know, why would you go to the first floor? You know, why would be the nave not longitudinal but transverse? You know, why would, I mean, there are all these kind of things which sort of starts to irritate, and then irritation is where the shift happens. You know, I mean, we've been running together this, you know, course on unheimlich, you know. So by saying that, I'm approaching this Unheimlichkeit in the Plečnik works. And maybe this unheimlich, so uncanny, It's the word to describe, or also why is it so interesting today, Because, it constantly provokes. It constantly actually demand for an observer or user to kind of spend their kilojoules of energy to sort of accustom, to position, It requires, Plečnik's works requires kind of active participation of individuals or public in that case, And this is something. If I refer now to what we in the office are trying to do, this is something which sort of like resonates, when you start doing the project, resonates as something which could be achieved by responding or shifting the brief into parallel condition.
Can I pick up on unheimlich, because I think it's an interesting prompt and it leads us into Freudian or Lacanian thought, but we can avoid it for a second. But I think what's good about it is Petra's proposition earlier about human centricism, how this is potentially related to when we talk about Plečnik's ability or architecture's ability to transform and transforming capacity. And with that I mean not only transforming on oneself, but also transforming the city. So it's kind of like rather than one-sided process, it goes back and forth.
Yeah, I think that this human-centeredness, it's an interesting contemporary topic. Okay, at the same time, it's a totally empty phrase. We're building for architects, for people are in the center, it's human-centered. But it is, and it is a phrase, but I think it's one of those phrases that we need to look again. Why? Because I think that we, human beings today, are being stupidified. Is that an expression? To making dumb, stupid, everywhere, all the time. So, let's make it simple for the people. Let's make them understand. Let's involve the people, the little idiots, into our architecture. So I think that Plečnik was like, well, I'm just doing architecture, let's say, but at the same time you could say he respected people. He thought like, they must be as smart as me. If I can see this, they can see it. And if they don't see it, sorry, I will not use bad language, let them make an effort. If they don't make an effort, well, that's not my problem. Ne? So, so this is this human-centeredness. So I think that architecture is like different arts, but it's not simply art, it's also science and technique, is potentially transformative power, not because it will make happy people, or let's say, okay, we have modernism. Modernism tried to change the world, let's simplify, and failed. It did fail. It didn't succeed. So, we should not throw away that idea. We should try again. And to try again, I think we have to think in a smaller scale, and part of that smaller scale is to respect people's intelligence, anyone's. So much about transformation, but I could say.
But I think that's interesting, and I'm wondering, Tomaž, what's your take on that? As humans, because you did place the UNESCO listing, human-centeredness was at its core. And I'm just wondering, because it feels that there's something to unpack here.
I mean, you used some really nice words, like, and showed the time of this, like, idiocracy or something like that we are. And Plečnik is in a way good with this, that he shows you that you don't need always notes with how to use. So basically, it's all the time like it's how to form an open platform, an openness to use it. It's like it's nothing grand, just to go into the city and spend the time like also doing nothing. And in that way, there is a big quality and basically also like humanity, because the space becomes open. Like when you were talking today about like architecture open to whole people, the whole community and so on, like I remember how, let's say, a few years ago, and basically probably still now, you have like designed those benches with, they were designed in a way that it wasn't for use, so the homeless people couldn't use it and so on, so the space could be empty. And basically, in this way, Plečnik is also contemporary, because he shows us, like, no, that's the wrong way. Basically, we have to make places like those benches on Vegova Street and Terrace that you show us, that is a true use, that it can be seen as a human-centered.
I think this also brings out the next thing that I wanted to touch on, which is this idea of public space. And I think Boštjan argues that through his notion of porosity and boundaries, but public space is something that negotiates between private and what is to be used by everyone. And I think Aleš's talk was really highlighting these things really well. So I'm wondering, Aleš, if you want to maybe expand on, you know, the meaning behind Plečnik's intervention for the public of Ljubljana today as well. Because it feels, I think you said something really profound, which is that Plečnik's work loses a temporal dimension. And I think this is very true. It feels contemporary at any given moment, but it also feels out of time at the same time. So I'm wondering, how does that relate to publicness in Plečnik's work?
It's a hard question. Huh? It's a good question, but a hard one, I think. Values are changing very fast in the world. Huh? As I said, in the last 35 to 50 years, it has all changed. Nobody would dream that Trump could be a president 30 years ago, you know. Nobody would dare to suggest that. Huh? And the values of his generation older than me, I never met Plečnik, you know. I imagine that his values were, so he wouldn't be acceptable today. How could he have a dialogue with the mayor of Ljubljana? I can't imagine that, you know. Because he had a human ethics, you know, which was completely different from what is now. And that's what I said. The last 10 years, this city is less friendly to local people than it was. Not just because of tourism, but mostly because of the city authorities, you know. Because, in very short, I would say, now it's profit over people, like Noam Chomsky would say, you know. That's so obvious in wherever you go. So his idea, basic idea, was to organize, as I wanted to show, you know, how can I say, to open as much as possible public spaces that would be accessible to anybody, to people with very different, you know, backgrounds. So, and now it's just the opposite. We are privatizing public spaces, you know. Every day it's less and less public space. People who have, students are not in the city anymore. They don't live in the city center anymore because it became too expensive for them.
Is there an argument that Plečnik's work does, though, fight against these appetites of capital? Because I'm just thinking the bench in front of Nuuk, right? How can mayor tamper with that?
How can?
Mayor sort of tamper with that.
At that time, you mean, or now?
Now. Because I think it's, I mean, the way I understood your talk is that Plečnik sort of fights against the privatization.
No, he didn't need to fight because values were so different at that time. He would need to fight today. Today,
and I
he's
think it
just
does.
the critique of what we are doing, or in what kind of city we live today. Huh? His ideas were very different from the ideas of those who run the city today. And unfortunately, the architects don't react, you know, to that. I mean, the Chamber of Architects, the Faculty of Architecture, the Architectural Association, they don't react. They just, you know, they're silent. And that's not the way we need to behave. But I wouldn't like to moralize now. Look.
No, but I think this is a good springboard, perhaps, to relate it back to nanotourism. Alyosha, I'm just wondering, you know, I think Aleš is bringing a good point. Is there an opportunity, or could we take this sort of a critique as to really think about what this summer school is trying to do, you know, or what it has been doing for the past 10 years?
So what has? I'm sorry, I had a shower.
Sorry.
I have water in my ears.
No, I'm wondering, what you're proposing is a sort
What
of
I'm proposing.
What you're saying is a critique of how the current municipality is dealing with public space. I'm wondering if the visiting school that we're doing now can sort of address some of these things.
I think it's not a question of projects, you know, of architectural projects. I think it's a general question of are we active in this society or not? For instance, I was lucky enough to study at the time of modernism. At that time, there was a project. Also, we don't know it was, we know today it was utopian. But at least they were fighting for something. Today, but that Kohlhaas said somewhere, you know, that after the neoliberalism, it all stopped because profit is the only reason to work on a project. So it's not public good anymore. So that's turned 30 years ago. It's not something new. But Renata Salecl, in one of the last books I read of her, she said the architects are silent. That's our problem. And she asked herself, what's the reason? Can I pick up on that? Of course, yeah.
Yeah, so sorry, no, it's different. I'm trying to address your question, which kind of directs the discussion also towards students, what we are doing with this architectural school. And yeah, the message, what Aleš, you have said, I mean, it's not your job to be silent. Right now, you have 2 weeks to express those opinions that you are going to, well, you heard a lot of those issues and views towards Plečnik today, but it's your job to kind of continue. And I'm really happy kind of the discussion revolved now around 2 crucial things. And one is open public space for the city. And the fact is that Ljubljana, as it is becoming more and more popular for visitors and also people who want to live here, to become inhabitants, it's getting denser and denser. And of course, a city needs also to generate economy. Otherwise, it cannot run in contemporary society today. But it is our job as architects, again, now as you, as the students of architecture, to show how public space is relevant and how it must remain in strictly public domain and what this domain literally is and how it can be facilitated for inhabitants and visitors alike. So I think that's directly the job and the discussion we are trying to address through these exercises. And I think this is a very nice platform of opening up. And I just maybe want to just, you know, jump back a little bit. This relationship between Plečnik's works and the user, which was underlined very thoroughly, I think it's also very crucial, and it resonates very well with what we have discussing in the morning, that one of the crucial things is a user. So you will have to kind of understand specific people and how they relate to consuming, maybe this is the wrong word, Plečnik in an active and, well, proactive way. So I really like this proposal of Petra that says, Plečnik needs a engaged and active user, and this is what it makes city alive and society functional.
This is great. I think, Petra, you have another point to add, right?
Yeah, just one little point. I actually think that we should look at this situation that maybe make a step forward from this dark picture, which I think that I can see it all the time. But let's look at this situation in a slightly different way. I think that we are actually at war. We have done many political wars, but we, as people every day, inhabitants of this planet, are at war. Basically, it's a war for two kinds of passion. I think they both are ran by passion. One is passion for money, simplify, which is a great passion. I know lots of people who are crazy about money. I mean, they really drives them. They are happy to wake up in the morning and so on. Just like we are. I mean, okay, I'm happy when I write something good, for instance. That's my passion. And my passion is also architecture, and I guess we share this. So it's a war going on. I think that it's very important to make alliances in this war, which means, concretely, to see good practices at work, to see what is already breaking this dark picture, which I see your project as orientation, going to this direction. How to refer to these firm points, although they may be just 7 in the whole universe, but that's good starting point. That's one thing. So I think let's look at each other who is doing something relevant, and let's connect. That's one thing. The second thing I would like to make, just for something previous, also maybe, Plečnik is not for granted good, I would say. I don't know. I know Christian Keres, who came to Ljubljana and looked at his work, and he said, this is terrible, this is Mickey Mouse architecture. It just didn't respond to his passion. And I think only lately I realized he's great. And I think it's also thanks to this initiative of UNESCO, for instance, and the whole last year a number of exhibitions, also Nika, your exhibition, that made this Plečnik more visible.
Tomaž, do you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe also to continue Aleš's thinking, how to say, public space is also always, as you said, it depends on the goals you have. Okay, in a way, Plečnik took Ljubljana as his playground and so on, but basically one of the goals was how to make our common space more friendly, human to use for everyone. Now the goals are changing, and for me it was interesting. Last Saturday I was walking from Dragon Bridge to the sluice gate on the side that is opposite to the marketplace, and now there is a new pavement there and so on. And basically it's a very nice space. And it's nice because it has nice greenery element, it has trees, it has a river, there are no cars, and also the historical layers are quite rich. But already it shows what are now contemporary goals. Now there are cafe places and so on. You already feel that behind that is more Airbnbs are coming, hotels and so on. So yeah, it's always are we just continue our goals that we see that aren't the best, or are there any other alternatives? And basically each day we are getting new and new spaces that are in a way a potential to make some difference, or are potential to continue the story that we already know where it will go. Because if from Dragon Bridge going back, we see what will happen if we will just continue. We will just get new cafes and place that is quite expensive to live.
Yeah, I mean, I would just kind of add, to this discussion of public spaces. If you think about design, and I'm referring to what you've just said, of public spaces, and then ask, what is, why you do that? Why you actually beautify the kind of open space in the city, which then by default it becomes public or used by public. It doesn't mean that it's a public space, but it's used by public, like strollers, bicycles, and so on. And what is the difference to what Plečnik did or has done? If you think about beautification, you think about something which tends to be comfortable, which tends to actually which doesn't tend to kind of provoke your activity, your participation. Beautified public spaces, if you can go to many of rearranged town square in Slovenia, and they're just beautified, But they do not provide any kind of trigger, any kind of spatial sequence which will first, I exaggerate here, put you in a little bit of a discomfort, but then sort of provoke you to kind of start using this space in a different way. And I think this active participation in the public space is something which we can learn from Plečnik. Because, that porous, less porous spaces are defined in a way, that they can be adjusted, or, that our behavior there could be adjusted, appropriated in a different way, depending on our mood, depending on, season, on rain, night, whatever, And this is something which is against, if I use this word again, beautification. It's that which actually moves, Vit, if I refer back to your question, moves to the parallel brief. It's not just a solution to the brief.
Not only beautification, but also commodification. Everything becomes comfortable. If you look at the Ljubljana today, the center of Ljubljana, it's like an endless interior. It's a living room. Even the cafes don't have chairs anymore, but kind of sofas when you lean and you are not, So I think that this is not only that we can learn from Plečnik, but this is Plečnik today. It's in fact a kind of, still, these spaces are against this commodification. They create situations where you become active. Even if you walk through the city, it's not like strolling like a potato bag, but it's like you are aware of your body. You react to the space that he creates, to the column he puts in front of you. So I think that this is very, even if you speak about freedom and imagination, as was one example, it is not like a freedom of laying in a kind of comfort situation, but it provides, it provokes thinking, like really active, like kind of activation, but through the body, not just through the mind, also through the body. And one of the topics in terms was also discomfort. And in fact, that I think is also very relevant, that it stimulates you in that way, on all the senses.
I like this proposal. It feels like Plečnik is a mode of resistance, that it kind of resists, let's say, a status quo of commodification, beautification. And I'm kind of wondering, that there was something about in Petra's talk about lack of final meaning that I interpret as ambiguity, potentially, of his spaces. And I guess something that Nika was also saying of Ljubljana as a garden, untamed, and, I could interpret that as open-endedness. And I think there's something potentially to unpack there. And I'm wondering, Nika, if you have any thoughts on, imagining Ljubljana as a garden, as this untamed human meets nature.
So what I was actually thinking about is really how Plečnik, the context in which Plečnik actually built, and how it actually was an intertwinement of different projects that actually happened. And I think that if we look at it from a slightly different way, you can see that his architecture really came in, like it was two projects at the same time, like the political, cultural, and then like him coming with his architecture, and it was like this idea that really worked. He addressed it well, like he invented this public space. So public space is not just there, it is invented, like it has an idea. It connects different spheres. So the public space is not only the street and the park and the bench, it's also the library, it's also the theater, it's also, you know, it's like what do we do as a community in like different activities. It's so I think I will come back to the garden, but just I want to say, because I think it's a nice metaphor, what I think is really missing, and I'm saying this as a metaphor, are the magazines in the Plečnik library, because he built the library and we still don't have the new library that we urgently need today. But if you go into the library, you go to the magazine library or, you know, the newspaper library reading room, and it's empty. There are no more magazines there. They haven't been ordering the new newspapers for like over a year because they save 8,000 euro per year. So there is just one giant screen in the middle of the room and students studying there because they don't have space to study at home. And I think this is very metaphoric, that actually his architecture works, and the ideas that embody the idea of public space as cultural space, Slovenian space, space connected with the past and past layers of the city and the history, and with topography and greenery, something that is very broad and wide and, you know, considering many different aspects of life, actually succeeded, but actually the political project failed. And the political project is really the one that keeps the materiality of this architecture there, be it the magazines or be it the bench or be it, you know, the pavement. So I think that actually we are a very nice community of architects, and we are Slovenians are very nice people, but we are very badly organized. You know, when it comes to the fact that we need to make decisions and organize so that we would preserve actually this architecture, and we say we say that it is UNESCO and it is protected, then we will say, he imagined this place for pedestrians, so we can use this as a brand, so let's work on that. It's like a city for pedestrians, and then not having really cars in the marketplace. That's the idea. Like, this is how you learn from architecture and put it into the agenda of the wider community, so different senses of communities evolve and learn from each other. And I don't think this is happening. We just use Plečnik as a brand, and it's so obvious because it's falling apart. You go into Križanke and it's like all these signs that are like, you know, there's stuff falling off, and it's sad. It's like you have these commercials in front of Križanke, not to talk about the Plečnik Stadium. So what I'm trying to say is that the context of the time today is really a result of a failed political project that would be about this public space, but his architecture persists with this materiality and gives us the opportunity to read these traces of what was imagined to be. And if we want to make changes in that sense, other things need to happen, not just architects thinking about this stuff. And where I think it is useful, for example, for the workshop like Nanotourism, and I think this nano idea is very nice because we tend to really be against tourism as such because of this commercialization of space, Airbnb prices, commodification, etc., etc. And of course, it's not going to go away, and it is not bad per se. It's just a question of how it is managed. How it is managed. And the people who are managing and deciding on what is and how is public space arranged, kept, how we use it, are very one-directional. It's all about profit, you know. I'm not saying it's an easy situation. I know that tourism brings a lot of money into Ljubljana and a lot of good things come from that. But I think what we urgently need is a dialogue a dialogue and in which communities can take part. It has to be more democratic. I'm absolutely sure about that.
Are there practices out there or projects that we do? It feels that the discussion went, it became a bit dire as Petra described it earlier. What's the way out? Do we see a way? So it's not like a vacuum type of situation where a bunch of architects are talking about how great or how horrible everything is. How do we break through? I guess this is what I'm wondering, and I don't know.
We're already breaking through. It's just in small points. I mean, just like, let's look at the things that are breaking through. Let's continue from those points. Let's insist from point to point. And let's see where this brings us.
Well,
you know.
One more thing that I would like to add.
Just to add one more thing. This dark picture is contemporary ideology. And it's very real, like every ideology. That's just the fact, but let's face it, it's not the only thing that's going on.
What I wanted to say is that really Ljubljana is actually quite amazing. And many things still exist despite this dire situation, and precisely because of the people of their understanding of how things could be. So a lot of these ideas, many of these ideas and spaces are kept alive due to very creative communities that address these issues. And sometimes I actually think that it's too good so that we live with this illusion how great it is, because people are really inventive on how they use spaces like festivals, what is possible to do with really little resources. So I think we are quite privileged, and I would not like to see this disappear, actually.
Yeah, because maybe when you ask what to do, basically the same importance is question what not to do, because basically, okay, it's always hard like to find new ideas, how to approach different and so on, but basically when you have also like a situation that you know what is not good, what is wrong, and when you decide not to do that, it's also the same importance. Like, we don't need that many new bars, hotels, and so on. And basically, as Nika said, we have a lot of content in the city, so give space to that content. And yeah.
I would just like to make myself more clear. I don't think there are two options, pessimism and optimism. I think there's a third option, that you build from the points of resistance, which is not optimistic. It's devilish, it's terrible, it's depressing, but you do that, you keep doing that. And I think I see initiatives, groups, individuals who work like this in this world. They fight.
Yes, and fighting, it's presenting case studies that activate those things that we are preserving. So we can speak on one hand, preservation by activation, and by that I mean that all these qualities of Plečnik that have been underlined through UNESCO and what we are speaking here today, when you rush through the city, whether you are inhabitant or visitor, these things are not clearly visible. So you quickly conform to superficial understanding of Plečnik and use of Plečnik works, although they're there, present all the time, and they're all the time around you. So by creating activities, case studies, to underline those things that are emphasized and clearly visible also to others who don't speak our language, but they can understand that. I think this is type of activism that can enhance all those qualities that we're speaking here about.
Just to respond shortly, and I believe that this kind of micro breaking points that are happening on different levels, like also discussion today, actions, projects, and so on, when they become if they're more and more, they become a movement. They really become a movement, and then we are stronger. So if you keep doing this, the movement will never come. So that's where I really see, I mean, it's happening already in architecture design discourse, that the movements, the initiatives all over the world, not just here, really it's a global phenomenon, are joining together.
I mean, if you think what could be done practically. So I mean, is that like, you know, that you would go to one of the embankment and you would actually, you know, burn the stores, which would actually make, you know, the embankment, you know, possible. You would actually really experience, you know, the public space and so on.
I thought you were going to say swim.
I mean, you can first burn and then you swim. You know? No, I mean, no, I'm really, you know, I think that this workshop could really become, I mean, should really be radical, you know. Yeah, really radical. That's what I'm saying, you know, like in proposing, you know. So it's not about like, you know, writing another regulation, you know, but it's really to show, you know, what is an architect's act, you know. Well, what is the, I mean, and you here, you know, you are here like for 2 weeks and you are kind of not loaded with all the, you know, things we know and we are confronted by, you know. So one can really respond in a more sort of liberated way, you know. And I do expect that, you know, the liberation.
I couldn't have thought of a better way to ask if there are any questions from the public. So thank you, Boštjan, for this. Anyone? Maybe a way to respond to what Boštjan is kind of teasing out, or clarification or reflection on what we've been talking about either now or earlier.
I think that the very important message of Plečnik work is the personal trust with the city building concern in Ljubljana, and the same in Prague, a very close connection to Alice Masarykova and Tomáš Masaryk. Without this personal trust, which we are now missing in our society everywhere, we cannot achieve such results as Plečnik did in these two cities. And Prague is also a garden. Thank you.
There we have a question.
Thank you for the talk. And it seems to me that the urban space making of Plečnik's work is, you know, has pretty clear advantage to the city. But I'm wondering that if we examine the buildings one by one, and the dimension of symbolism, or the importance of symbolism, seems to be quite, it seems to occupy a rather less significant position well, at least in the discourse that we are having. And I'm wondering, I'm just curious why, or whether you think that the formal complexity and the symbolic complexity of his work, that in my view establishes his work's connection with the idea of architectural history. I'm wondering why these two aspects are quite absent in the discussion, let's say, or do you think that we should be looking at those qualities of Plečnik's work anymore?
I think these are two important dimensions of his work. I think they were very much explored in the 1980s when Plečnik was discovered again at the time of postmodernism, this symbolic dimension and his language in relation to art history. I think this was the topic of that time, and I think it could be relevant today. I don't have any more to say, but maybe you wanted to ask something more than this.
Maybe I can add something. To explain a little bit upon your question is that, explaining the context, historical context of discussions about Plečnik. So I have the feeling that the symbolism was addressed quite a lot with maybe like the previous generation of professionals who have studied Plečnik, and they have put the formal language of Plečnik, and with that also symbolism and so on the foreground of his works. And I think through this kind of change of understanding, change of society and new generations that have been thought about architecture in a more contextual way and in a way of seeing spaces, how they work, and maybe just kind of putting the formal languages in the background in order to not be amplified over the meanings of spatial organization, creating of urbanity, creating of a society, and all these things. So I think, as in the past, those discussions were more present, and now maybe we are much more interested in what is beyond just the formal language and just kind of symbolism of those elements, but more to look at coherently of what does it mean in architectural organization of space. If that might partly answer your question. I don't know if everybody agrees.
I mean, maybe just to add on, and then I will pass the phone. Yeah. I mean, what we are trying to do, or there is a kind of a try to separate Plečnik's work from Plečnik as persona. So to kind of, because, in the past there was always a read, Plečnik as personality, and then this personality then reflected in the work, or vice versa. So if you want to get like Plečnik, I'm going to use this word, productive and pragmatic, it's good to kind of separate that. So we're talking about, and I'm referring to what Alyosha had just said, to Plečnik work, as such, as body of work, And then if you try to perceive that as sort of like read and avoid all the symbolism, everything what is actually added on as additional meaning, and get really into the essence of architecture, material, volumetric sequences of that work. I think it's a better way to get familiar as well.
I remember one time you used a term, we have to save Plečnik from Plečnik. Maybe regarding symbolism, this is something that was very, let's say, popular to do with Plečnik in the past, especially 80s, 90s and so on. But let's say like this, Plečnik with symbolism was, he was a master for symbolism in a way that he always knew how to how to speak with symbols, but open the content, left the content very open. So in a way, Plečnik was dealing in basically projects, also Prague, Ljubljana and so on, in times that were like, when the identities were changing all the time, like in Ljubljana you had the kingdom, but still at the same time it was some kind of a symbolic national capital and so on. And basically what we can learn from him, how to in symbols surpass only this is the right thing and left things more open.
Just two short comments. One is that this is an interesting question because I think it shows something about architecture, how it works, that, you know, within different times, different sides, aspects of a work can be seen. For instance, Plečnik's work, as we said, in the 1980s there was this symbolic and art historical dimension very much present, which doesn't mean that it shouldn't be present today. It just tells our interest, which I think overlaps those who were speaking today, shows something, as Alyosha said, about our time, about our issue, about this particular moment in the world. But that's not the only option, so maybe you should go into this direction. What I would like to emphasize is to agree with Tomaž that if a work is good, that's the most general term, if it is well constructed, then it cannot be reduced to the meanings that the architect tried to put into it. An architect is not a master of her work. The work lives on and produces all kinds of different meanings.
Yeah, maybe Vika has also.
I think the question of symbolism is a relevant one, and why Plečnik's architecture is also so interesting is because it has so many levels of understanding, be it from the level of the city, the symbolism of the city, then to the level of particular details, of the use of columns, of the use of classical, forms, then to craft, etc. So that's why it's particularly interesting, and he was really a master. He really overplayed each of these categories very well. So to say probably today is not the time that it is possible to do as many details, to think about the level of the really individual elements of particular architecture, so that this craft is just not there anymore. So he built architecture in times where there were craftsmen, and he was very knowledgeable about how to use also precious materials. So you can, on that level, you can think about the symbolism, or how that comes into architecture and how it works, really of how things are produced today. Where is the craft today? What kind of meaning can the appearance of craftsmanship have in today's architecture? Then on the level of the architectural objects, let's say if I skip scale, of course there is again the replaying of form, of space, and there are always the classical discipline is the one that we're constantly learning from, of course. Of course the temple will not look the same as it looked in Plečnik's times, and we could see Boštjan's interpretation of it. It was something radically different, but you can see that it's working on the idea of the temple. So of course. And then how these things kind of work in the composition of the city. I think this is a very relevant, idea of how you think of different nodes in space, and how in certain perspectives meaning can be produced as how things are organized in space as compositions, as a part of the wider whole. And here I will connect back to the garden, meaning that that Plečnik, in this wider ranging of Ljubljana, how he actually used green elements, meaning greenery or trees, different forms and shapes of trees and greenery as architectural objects. So it's like the classical merges with the natural, and I'm not saying he was landscaping, but really integrating something that gives a presence of something that you cannot control, to the idea that we are a part of the cyclical time and changing of nature. And if you think about the three bridges that Aleš was beautifully commenting on, if you go there, there's the bridges, but there all of a sudden you see a tree. But it's not the trunk of a tree, it's the upper part of the tree, which makes you think, where is this tree coming from? And you look down and you see the river. And he's constantly playing this. It's the same with the Shoemaker's Bridge, but there's a column. So he's using green elements and plants as architectural elements as well. And I think this is on the level of architecture. I think it's a nice metaphor for how we can think of the city as a garden, something that we cultivate, something that we co-organize, that we democratically think about for the future. I'm done.
Yeah, I managed to answer more on you later, but now you opened a new interesting topic, so I don't know if that's relevant anymore. But but yeah, depending like symbols, like in the past, I remember when we were doing UNESCO nomination, and all the time different experts were telling about the doorbell of the library building, like that Pegasus, and it was like. It was too much, and it was like one was that means Pegasus. The second one is that's taken from a lyric from an old poem, a folk poem, and so on. And it was so irrelevant in a way, basically. And the real thing with like symbolism is like what is very beautiful, like with Plečnik's approach, and it was also a great heritage, basically, for the future monuments in, let's say, ex-Yugoslavia and so on. Is like. How to build a memory and symbol in a way that the whole community can accept it, and in a way, let's say, if you take war memorials also in Yugoslavia and so on, we can see much of resemblance also taken from Plečnik's architecture. It's like trying to make, to develop a memory and make it in a peaceful way, that we can all remember and we can live together in the future. And that is one of his big heritages. Basically, in a way, he was like land artist, in a way very abstract, but at the same time, he managed to develop this concrete memory in a way that, let's say, people could, let's say, live with it in a way.
Can I just reflect on your answers a bit? I think Jean-Marc's question kind of answers the obsoleteness, potentially, or irrelevance. Or maybe, as Petra suggests, it will become relevant again. And I guess this is what Maja is saying. So I think it's quite something interesting happening with that it has been studied. Maybe we're asking some other questions at the moment, but it might emerge again. But I think there's something else that kind of came to mind, and I think the idea of detachment that Boštjan kind of introduced of, you know, Plečnik is a person and Plečnik's work, and then the idea of value judgment that we sort of discussed earlier. What's good, what's bad? What do we think about shops and sofas? And I'm just wondering if there's something hiding also about, well, let me layer it on top actually. The idea of genius that sort of Nika is trying to debunk, the idea of master that we also referenced in our text, and master being very intrinsically related to exploitation, potentially. You can probably interpret it in that way. Or the question of who is rendered invisible in Plečnik's story. And I'm just wondering, you know, when we speak about Plečnik, who are we not talking about? I have no clue. But I think there is, I mean, also Petra, the way you refer to architect is she, I think there is something about, you know, this male-centric figure of a master that Plečnik often is being archetyped as. And I'm wondering if the discussion, you know, the idea of how is Plečnik relevant, it's maybe also to open different discussions. Glossary that Maja also introduced. The project of body. I think it kind of does that in a way, right? It's debunking it.
No, I just want to, maybe you don't know it, but when this exhibition was done here at the museum, Tomaž, Miloš, who else was the curator? Natalia, prosti. Yeah. And Bogo, yes. So there was a chapter on these collaborators who were left out from the history, but in this relationship it was called Under the Common Roof. So you work on that. Milos is there. He worked on that, right, Milos? Yes. So yeah, this was
I think, I mean, Milos, do you want to engage? I think it might be interesting for a wider public also to understand it in the context of Plečnik. Come, join us. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, the chapter was devoted to, I guess, a problematic past understandings of the relation between the master and his devoted students on one hand and the students who betrayed him. It was very biblical story up until quite recently, I think, and a lot about Plečnik in the past was slightly theological, including the fact that you might not know that he was, or maybe he still is, on some sort of a track to being sanctified, perhaps, by the Catholic Church. So what I guess I really enjoyed, by the way, today's discussion and presentations, and what is perhaps not obvious to people who don't know the discourses you mentioned in passing, the discourses of the 70s, 80s and the 90s, is how burdened with these past meanings we usually understood them. And a lot of what we heard today, I think, is a reaction to that, and maybe that's not so obvious if you don't know the older discourses about. So one of these was the very devoted, selflessly devoted collaborators that mostly did Plečnik's bidding. On the other hand, I can't deny that Plečnik was not an authoritative figure who, in some way, always totally controlled his project. But he did that in an interesting way, and in many different ways. And the point of this exhibition, in going into this part of the exhibition, in going to the archives, not only into the Plečnik archive, but also in the archives of his collaborators, what did they leave in their own personal archives related to collaborating with Plečnik, did show, I think, quite nuanced and interesting, and in some ways more democratic, and in other ways perhaps more authoritarian picture, or at least a very different picture to what we usually understood as. And in relation to gender, in relation to authorship, in relation to the fact, interestingly, that Plečnik, of course, never let off his own control of the project, but he was, in a way, you could say, so hubristic that he also understood his authority of designate someone as the author of the work that he mostly did. That also happened. So I guess very short answer would be, it's very complicated and very interesting.
Oh, this is great. Thank you so much. I'm conscious of time. I'm wondering if there are any more responses, questions from the public, or potentially, yes.
I was wondering about, we had a lot about architecture in human scale, architecture for everybody, and I was thinking about, at this point in time with Plečnik, was there also accessibility for disabled people or elderly people also a topic, or was this something that came up later, because now it would be quite interesting to implement that if we have to.
Anyone?
Well, he likes steps, so that doesn't help. But no, I mean, basically, yeah, it's like for disabled, it's hard to say. I mean, it's very pedestrian friendly in a way. So, I mean, in a way, it's very like, yeah, it's very like user friendly. Yeah, but like in this the term like for disabled. I mean, basically, Ljubljana is made like a network of connections and so on. And even though he liked steps, you always had just a step forward, probably somewhere, some ramp to go. there. So yeah, in that way. But yeah, but I don't think he was thinking that much on that topic.
I mean, you know, like when Plečnik's work was built, realized the regulations were completely different in any kind of way, you know. So like the height of the fence, you know, the ramps, you know, and so on, you know. So when we are talking about inclusive spaces, I think that still a lot of things should be done and must be done, that these spaces, public spaces, should be really inclusive for all, you know.
Thank you. Any other? Maybe we have time for one more question.
So this will maybe be a bit provocative question, and it's connected to our faculty, but do you believe that we study Plečnik critically enough? Because I think that we are constantly fed with Plečnik and with this idea that Plečnik is genius, and God forbid someone say against that. But I think that we're missing the real point, the point of we study him as genius, but we don't study the geniusness of his architecture. I mean, we have Ljubljana, which is basically a playground to study Plečnik's architecture, but I think that we are just so fed with this idea of him being genius that we oversee actually the good part of his architecture. And as a participant of this workshop, I fear that I will like put forward somehow this idea to also other participants, and I wonder if we, especially the people from our faculty, will be able to like study the works or like participate critically enough.
I'm sure that you will. I mean, that's why you joined this workshop.
I think that this course, the presentations that you've seen today, they were detached from this idea of genius and emphasized his ideas in his work, the concepts, attitudes, approaches, which are relevant and important today. So yeah.
No fear.
I think you made a very good point, but maybe you can start with that it's really not good, Plečnik, you know, because it's really not necessarily good, and that's the problematic, interesting part of architecture and challenge that there's no objective, this is good, you know. But whatever, that's, as you know, your problem. But I think you really raise a good point.
Yes, a very good question. And maybe just from the organizer's point of view, that's why we valued so much Tomaž's intervention, and you explained the criteria of UNESCO and what it worked and what it didn't work. And I think your initial few minutes of your presentation in a way answer your question, because UNESCO has very high standards and they are not interested in any abstract geniuses, but of real value, what we were lucky to see through your presentation. No?
Yeah, maybe just to add, but not on a UNESCO way, but more in a way that I think that the situation is getting better. I think that, let's say, if we compare like Plečnik's year 2017 and Plečnik's year 2022, there was already a difference. Or if we, let's say, compare, if we go even far way back, let's say, Georges Pompidou exhibition or AB magazine that you created, let's say, I think that situation changed a lot. So basically, we are moving away from this only like personality view and talking more and more on the content.
Can we, with this ultimately optimistic point, conclude today's roundtable? I would really like to thank again to all the speakers for your thought-provoking presentations, as well as this really interesting discussion, really interesting questions, and for everyone to power through the day one and the symposium. And thanks again. Let's continue now with a bit of informal socializing in the atrium. I think the bar is open if anyone needs a drink. And thanks again.